Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Lettuce Head Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Journalist Deku Met Unstable Hero. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Oh my effing god, you have got to be kidding me, came a low growl from further along the underground pedestrian route. The overhead lights flickered ominously in the low light of the underground shopping area. The shops were closed for the night, gates locked tight to protect overpriced fashion merchandise from burglars with outlandish taste in accessories. Izuku stood at the end of the hall, frozen in a mixture of excitement and horror. About halfway down the hall, staring at a vending machine like it had personally insulted him, was none other than Ground Zero. Pro hero, certified badass, and threatener of inanimate objects, apparently. Most journalists on a hero beat would have thanked their lucky stars. Izuku cursed his instead. Of all the heroes to run into, why did it have to be this a-hole? So help me, if you don't give me my coffee, the hero scowled, punching at the button on the machine a few more times. This behavior had a similar effect on the machine as the threats, absolutely none whatsoever. Izuku smirked a little to himself, which was probably mean, but it was nice to see that even someone like Ground Zero didn't always get what he wanted. The hero grabbed the sides of the machine and shook it hard. When that didn't work, the hero got down on his knees, pulling off one of his grenade gauntlets and sticking his hand up inside the machine from below, grimacing as he felt around. If it hadn't been so pathetic to watch, it might have been amusing to see a pro hero cussing out a vending machine that looked like it was chewing on his arm. Feeling as though he'd had enough entertainment for the night, Izuku spun on his heel, intending to head down to the subway platforms before he missed his last train. From behind, he could hear the telltale rattle of vandalizing a vending machine come to a stop, so he could only assume the pro hero had given up on prying his drink out of the machine. He didn't think anything more of it until a gruff voice called out after him. "Hey you!" Izuku felt himself turning around before his brain quite caught up with his muscle memory. "Yeah. You have scrawny arms," Ground Zero said in a matter-of-fact tone, locking his grenade gauntlet back into place. It didn't sound like he meant it to be an insult, but Izuku couldn't help feeling a bit miffed. "So," he answered, defensively crossing said appendages across his chest. "So stick your arm up in this effing thing and get my coffee for me." Ground Zero pointed to the vending machine. Izuku blinked. "I'm sorry. I can't get my arm in deep enough," Ground Zero explained agitatedly, "and I only have 2 minutes left to pound it before I'm back on the clock. Just do it." There was no way in hell Izuku was getting down on his knees in front of anyone, but especially not Ground Zero. He had his pride. Also, Ground Zero. Who even liked that self-important explosive hero, anyway? He was a JRK who cared nothing for civilians, collateral damage, or anything but flashy rescues and looking badass. Izuku wouldn't get him a coffee if the man were dying of thirst. While he didn't put it that way exactly, the words leaving Izuku's mouth nonetheless did a decent job of getting his point across. Why the hell would I do a thing like that? Ground Zero sighed exasperatedly. "I don't have any more cash on me. The can won't effing come out and I could use some goddamn caffeine before pulling another double. Goddamn, what crawled up your butt and died? Just help me out for a second." Izuku wanted nothing more than to turn around and pretend none of this had ever happened. What an a-hole. Who did Ground Zero think he was, just barking out orders like that? "Hell no," Izuku told him, turning to march away. "What the F-dash?" the pro hero yelped. "It's just a effing coffee. So buy yourself another one." Izuku snapped. It wasn't his DMN fault that the pro hero had only brought a measly 200 yen with him as pocket change, so why was he expected to have enough money to buy him a coffee? What an entitled a-hole, he thought, turning around to tell him exactly that. As Izuku's eyes landed on the pro hero, it dawned on him that antagonizing a man who sweats nitroglycerin may not have been his wisest decision. Ground Zero was coming right at him, and for a second Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, certain the next sensation he would experience was to be an intense burning feeling all over his body. Fortunately, Ground Zero seemed perfectly happy to simply grab him by the collar and slam him against the wall. When Izuku opened his eyes, He locked gazes with the pro hero. The explosion quirk user's eyes were wide, white ringing his irises in all sides. His pupils were like tiny pinpricks, and his breath came in forced gasps. "The F is wrong with you?" he demanded, and something about the whole situation set off serious warning bells in Izuku's head. The kind of warning bells he hadn't heard since he'd been mercilessly bullied in high school. Ground Zero looked ready to do something drastic, over something as mundane as coffee. Okay, fine, I'll get your coffee," Izuku promised, wriggling out of Ground Zero's grasp and marching over to the machine and pulling out his wallet, trying to calm himself, willing his hands not to shake, trying to sound less intimidated than he felt. Had he said Ground Zero yet? Because seriously, this guy. Ground Zero followed Izuku over to the vending machine, hovering over his shoulder oppressively, watching Izuku's every move. He grunted in acknowledgement when Izuku inserted the coins, not even a thank you, and punched the button for his precious coffee once Izuku had stepped aside. After a moment of whirring, the machine spat a hot can of coffee into the bottom of the machine to be retrieved. The pro hero swooped down on it like an addict finally getting his hands on a fix. He fumbled the hot can, popping it open and lifting it to his lips with trembling hands. The can tipped too far and the hero choked on his first gulp, fingers clenching convulsively and sending the can clattering to the floor only after it emptied the majority of its contents down the front of Ground Zero's costume. For a moment, the pro hero stared blankly at the can. Then he roared in fury, kicking it viciously. The can bounced off the wall and rolled back to his feet where he stomped on it repeatedly. Once he'd tired of stomping on it, the hero stared down at the unfortunate lump of aluminum for a long moment before swearing at it creatively, profusely, and at top volume for what felt like an hour but was probably under a minute. Meanwhile, Izuku had backed away from the abrasive hero and had flattened himself against the wall, trying not to flinch as coffee splattered against his pants with each of Ground Zero's stomps, trying not to cower and cover his ears in an attempt to drown out the onslaught of vitriol. As suddenly as they'd begun, the words died half-formed in the pro hero's mouth. His shoulders slumped as his head drooped and his clenched fists relaxed. Ground Zero sighed dejectedly and buried his face in his hands. "F-," he said in a broken voice, the sound muffled ever so slightly by the palms of his hands. This was wildly outside of Izuku's comfort zone. He wasn't comfortable with public displays of emotion just on general principle, but this felt like something out of a horror movie. The flickering lights, deserted train station hallway, a once lauded hero finally snapping over something as mundane as a cantankerous vending machine. If Izuku had to put down money on a hero he most expected to go bad, he would have bet on Ground Zero, hands down. But he wouldn't have bet it would be over a vending machine and a spilled can of coffee, and definitely wouldn't have guessed that he would watch the hero crumble before his very eyes. Feeling distinctly uncomfortable but no longer fearing imminent bodily harm, Izuku eased away, back still plastered flat against the wall until he'd made it a good 5 meters back. He continued to creep away after that, intent on getting as far away from this awkward scene as possible without attracting the hero's attention again. He just wanted to catch his train home before Ground Zero turned violent again. As Izuku skulked back down the hall, the hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stood up. He slowed to a stop, hyper-aware of his surroundings. God, he really didn't want to be right about Ground Zero. At least, not when he might be the one to bear sole witness to the shattering of a pro-hero's psyche. In the distance between them, Izuku heard the whisper of air, the quiet rumble of trains, and Ground Zero's ragged, labored breathing. It seemed almost unnaturally quiet after the shouts, and the empty, cold silence filling the stale air sent a chill down Izuku's spine. He found himself growing morbidly curious and he turned around to look one more time, despite his better judgment. Ground Zero still stood exactly where he'd been standing before, but Izuku could detect an air of despair sinking down on the hero, permeating the air between them like a thick perfume, choking the two of them with its smothering stench. "Damn it," Izuku muttered to himself before fully turning around. He better not miss his last goddamn train for this. He walked back towards Ground Zero. "Did you want another coffee?" The pro-hero started, like he'd forgotten Izuku was even there. "Oh, shit, no," he patted absently at his shirt, scowling at the wet coffee spreading down the length of it. F me, he said brokenly, which frankly had Izuku reeling. Ground Zero was not the type to mope or give up, even when he had no business sticking with whatever idiotic mess he'd gotten himself into. Izuku found himself demanding answers before he quite realized how stupid it was. What's wrong? Instantly on the defensive, Ground Zero's eyes landed on him, brilliant scarlet and piercing. Nothing, off. He growled at Izuku before stiffening and muttering to himself under his breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. When he turned back to Izuku, his gaze seemed less feral. He looked almost bland, as if that was even a word one could justify using when attempting to describe someone like Ground Zero. What I mean is, worry not, citizen, everything is under control. Izuku looked down at the crumpled coffee can, then back at the hero. I can see that, he said in a mild sort of tone that clearly stated he was not actually agreeing, simply attempting to pacify the volatile hero. Ground Zero clenched his fists, pressing his lips together in a thin line before shutting his eyes briefly. They flew open again and he stared at Izuku for a long moment. Do you want an autograph? Izuku shook his head. No. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. You seemed distressed. Ground Zero barked a derisive laugh. How's someone like you supposed to help a guy like me even if I did need rescuing? I did buy you a coffee, Izuku snapped. You could at least say thank you. Fine, I'll buy you a replacement. Ground Zero extended a hand and scowled at Izuku. Izuku stared blankly at his hand. Sorry? He looked up at the pro-hero in confusion. What do you want, a handshake? Ground Zero looked at Izuku like he'd spat in his hand. Your phone, you moron. Izuku did as he asked, feeling thoroughly baffled. What does my phone have to do with Dash? The hero snatched the phone from Izuku, scowled, and shoved it back in his face. Unlock it. Izuku did as he was told, asking as he did so, Am I being mugged? Why do you dash? Ground Zero took the phone back from Izuku with a growl. How the F am I supposed to buy you a replacement coffee if I can't find you again? He explained, throwing the phone back at Izuku. Izuku fumbled the phone, nearly dropping it with a yelp. He stared back at Ground Zero, feeling both touched and utterly baffled. I didn't think you were serious, he commented weakly. Ground Zero narrowed his eyes at Izuku. I always fucking say exactly what I mean. Don't forget that. Izuku nodded slowly, right? I'll keep that in mind. At that point Ground Zero must have decided it was time to go, stomping past Izuku, his broad shoulders jostling the smaller man on his way by. You better, he rumbled ominously, and then he was gone. Before Izuku could quite process what had just happened, he realized he was standing alone, in a creepy shopping area of a train station lit by flickering lights, with only a smashed coffee can for company. He looked down at his phone and saw that Ground Zero had apparently added himself as a new contact on his phone. Except, rather than adding a normal name, or even his hero name, Ground Zero had entered himself as King Explodo Kill. Izuku shook his head slowly. What a weirdo, he muttered, about to shove his phone back in his pocket when his eyes landed on the time at the top of the screen. Sheet! Izuku exclaimed, nearly tripping over himself as he spun around. I'm going to miss my last train. Walking on unsteady legs, Bakugo Katsuki staggered into his apartment, nearly tripping over the entryway as he shed his shoes and stumbled barefoot across the floor, listing dangerously until he crashed against the wall, sliding down to his knees. For a moment he stayed like that, clinging to the wall, breathing heavily. You drunk again? Katsuki looked up, blinking blearily until the disappointed face of his roommate swam into view. F off, shitty hair, he said, more out of habit than a real desire to be left alone. I just worked a double and feel like sheet. So, punch drunk, then. Kirishima Idru, better known to the public as the pro-hero Red Riot, folded his arms, though the look of disapproval on his face softened incrementally. You hungry? Katsuki had made his way back to his feet, swaying like his inner ear thought he was on a boat. I'm going to bed, he said, keeping one hand on the wall as he trudged down the hallway towards his room. Take a bath. Kirishima called after him, his look of disapproval morphing into concern. Katsuki waved him off dismissively, ignoring the bathroom door and disappearing into his room a moment later. If past performance would provide any kind of insight in the way of future results, Kirishima was certain that were he to poke his head in later, he'd find Katsuki still fully dressed and splayed out across the bed, not even having bothered to crawl under the covers. Kirishima pressed his lips into a thin line and shook his head with a sigh. "I wish you would just tell me what happened," he said in an undertone, pinching the bridge of his nose and sighing. With a groan, he pulled himself up off the couch, stretching out his back before moving into the kitchen to wrap up the plate of food he'd laid out on the counter for Katsuki earlier. He muttered under his breath as he went about his task, grumbling about idiot friends who wouldn't talk to friends about what was bothering them and working themselves to death. He tossed the plate into the fridge with a sigh, wandering back across the living room and flicking on the TV. The channel was set to a national news station, currently reporting on the biggest story of the week. 9 days have passed since the horrible quirk-related accident that resulted in the deaths of 2 innocent civilians, and things aren't looking good for up-and-coming pro-hero Ground Zero. Lauded as one of the most promising young heroes to emerge in this decade, many are beginning to wonder if that fame has gone to his head, claiming that Ground Zero is not cautious enough when fighting in heavily populated areas. Considering how dangerous an explosive quirk can be, it's no surprise that even one small mistake can have real, often deadly consequences. In recent days, we've seen authorities continue to deny Ground Zero access to areas with a large civilian presence. Meanwhile, victims in need of rescue have begun to outright refuse cooperation with the disgraced hero. With public opinion of this explosive quirk user at an all-time low, one can't help but wonder why Ground Zero has refused to keep a low profile in the wake of last week's tragedy. In other news, Kirishima turned off the TV with a sigh. He knew it wouldn't make sense to the press, to anyone that didn't know Katsuki. To them, it would look selfish, like he was refusing to grieve for the victims of that horrific accident. They didn't see him working himself to exhaustion, see the way he stumbled home at the end of the day, looking haunted, as though he were relentlessly pursued by the ghosts of his failures. Last week's disaster had been the worst incident by far, and Katsuki still refused to talk about it. Idru was at his wit's end. His good friend was closed off, but obviously upset and trying to somehow prove something to himself, though Kirishima couldn't for the life of him guess what that could be. The night after the incident, when Katsuki had returned, he'd been white as sun-bleached bone with a look in his eyes like he'd been pushed to the breaking point. When he tried to bring up the accident, "Katsuki, did you hear what happened? Everyone's talking about Dash." Katsuki had interrupted him with a rough growl, "I know what happened." He'd fixed his deep, red eyes on Kirishima then. "I don't want to talk about it." So Kirishima hadn't pressed him. But it had been 9 days now, and ever since that day all Katsuki seemed to do was get up, hero, sleep, repeat. Idru wasn't even sure his friend was eating regularly, and the walls may have been thick, but even through them he could hear Bakugu's tossing and turning, the whimpers and screams telling Idru that Katsuki's nights were plagued by terrible dreams. It didn't help that the media seemed obsessed with the fall of Ground Zero. Idru couldn't go anywhere without hearing about the 2 dead civilians, and he was certain that whatever discomfort he experienced because of this, it was small potatoes compared to how it must have been affecting Katsuki. Idru leaned back on the couch with a sigh. Katsuki had been given a day off after the disaster and he'd gone into cover for a coworker instead. The man had been working for 9 days straight at this point, and Idru was worried. He couldn't keep this up, working like this was destroying his body, and yet Katsuki refused to take a day off. He may not have been a licensed psychologist, but even Kirishima knew what this was. Katsuki was running from introspection, trying to escape how he was feeling, trying to hide from the reality of what had happened 9 days ago. What had happened? All Idru knew was what they'd said on the news. There'd been some kind of domestic dispute. When it was discovered that a dangerous quirk was involved, they'd called in heroes as backup. From what the media seemed to believe, there had been an altercation between the abuser and Ground Zero, and when the first responders got there, both victims of the domestic disturbance, a mother and child, were dead, nothing left behind but their charred corpses. The abuser was in critical condition, and had since slipped into a coma from his injuries. According to eyewitness reports, Ground Zero had been found cradling the body of the child in his arms, rocking back and forth and saying, "I'm sorry," over and over again. Now, this wasn't exactly an admission of guilt, at least in Ijuru's mind, but it sure seemed that way to the press, who latched on to the idea that Ground Zero, long criticized for the damage his quirk caused, had now killed 2 civilians. People had demanded he be locked up, there had been protests outside City Hall, and news. Stories began running about villain attack victims who actually ran away from Ground Zero instead of running to him. It had to be killing Katsuki to see it. Every day he slipped further and further down the ranks of heroes until there were even several new, and frankly terrible rookie heroes more highly rated than the once great Ground Zero. There was going to be a trial. People wanted answers. And to be perfectly honest, so did Ijuru. But Katsuki wouldn't talk to him. He'd trained with Bakugo at UA for years. He knew that he would never have injured civilians, he was too careful for that. But that didn't make him any less curious, he was still desperate to know what happened. Whatever it was, it couldn't have been good. But Ijuru knew Katsuki well enough to know that there was something to the whole event that the media didn't know. He just wished Katsuki would tell him what it was. With a sigh, Ijuru pulled himself off the couch and headed for the bathroom. If Katsuki still wasn't ready to talk, then he might as well head to bed himself. Before he took a bath, he poked his head in Katsuki's door to check on the hero and sighed. Fully dressed, flopped across the bed spread eagle, snoring lightly. Ijuru eased the door shut before turning back to the bathroom. If he was still sleeping like that after Ijuru's bath, then Ijuru would get a blanket or 2 and lay them over him to keep him warm through the night. That decided, Ijuru proceeded with his nightly ablutions, a small frown of worry wrinkling his brow as he went about his business. Too soon, Katsuki's phone was yelling at him to wake up. With a low groan, he reached out, fumbling to snooze the alarm. He did this without actively opening his eyes, which didn't do much to help him silence the DMN thing, though he did manage to knock his phone off the bed and onto the floor, so at least it wasn't as loud. After a few more seconds of sustained alarm noise, Katsuki groaned, peeling his eyes open. His head pounded and he felt like he'd been hit by another truck. God, he needed coffee. Preferably a whole goddamn carafe of the strongest espresso he could find. Or a crate of Red Bull. He wasn't picky. Hell, he'd take a whole bottle of caffeine pills at this point. Katsuki rolled himself off the bed and fell to the ground with a loud thump. He grumbled under his breath, untangling the blankets from around his legs and wrinkling his nose at the smell he was giving off. He needed a shower, and probably should have just taken one last night. Not that he'd ever admit it to Kirishima, especially since that blockhead would never shut up about it if he actually did. Struggling to uncocoon himself from the blankets someone, probably Mother Hen Kirishima, had laid over him after he'd fallen asleep the night before, Katsuki finally managed to get a hand on his phone and silence the alarm. With a heavy sigh he struggled to his feet, feeling dizzy. He closed his eyes briefly, waiting for the sensation to pass. When it didn't, he growled under his breath and tottered across the hall and into the bathroom with a snarl. 1 2-minute shower later and he was back in his room and pulling on some civvies. He didn't bother to check in the mirror, he was too goddamn exhausted to give one solitary F about what he looked like anyway. He staggered into the kitchen like a man who was half drunk and half hungover. Kirishima was sitting at the island, sipping a mug of coffee. Another mug was sitting in front of him, steaming. Bakugo knew a trap when he saw one. He ignored the mug and Kirishima's silent offer of companionship in favor of tugging open the fridge, grabbing the first can of Red Bull he saw, popping the top and chugging it all in one go. He exhaled deeply, wiping at his mouth and slamming the empty can down on the counter, turning to walk out. "That's not breakfast," Kirishima commented mildly, a hard undercurrent to his usually genial tone. "Not hungry," Bakugo fired back, stomping out of the kitchen. Kirishima was a good friend. Too good, sometimes. Bakugo didn't deserve him, never really had. Or more accurately, Kirishima didn't deserve a shitty friend like Bakugo. Cursing under his breath, Bakugo tried to think about something else, without success. He supposed it was still better than the alternative. Rather than force himself to spend another awkward minute of pointed silence in their shared apartment, Bakugo yanked on his shoes and stormed out of the place, slamming the door pointedly as he went. Back in the kitchen, Kirishima stared forlornly at the mug of coffee. He didn't eat dinner either, he told the mug sadly. The mug did not answer. All Izuku knew was that Ground Zero was dim and lucky he hadn't made him miss the last train. He thought this while sipping his fifth mediocre cup of coffee from the soft drink bar and tapping aggressively at his laptop keyboard. For the third time that week, Izuku found himself in a 24-hour family restaurant because no other restaurants in this godforsaken country opened before 10 a.m. and he couldn't stand the sight of his closet-sized apartment for even 1 minute longer. With a heavy sigh, Izuku rested his forehead on the laptop trackpad and groaned. He was running out of battery life on the computer, and there weren't even any outlets in the vicinity. If only his editor were a patient man. But he wasn't, and Izuku had a deadline to meet. He kept getting distracted, though, his mind straying back, unbidden, to the vision of Ground Zero losing it at a vending machine the night before. Of all the heroes Izuku wrote about, he'd never expected that it would be Ground Zero who would break under the pressure of negative public opinion. Admittedly, the course hero's popularity and ranking had taken a nosedive since he'd botched what should have been a simple domestic abuse call. The case had yet to go to trial, and though Ground Zero was not being charged with anything, many people believed there was more to the story than was being said. Someone had died, someone who wouldn't have died if a hero without an explosion quirk had walked into that already too volatile situation that fateful night. Not that Midoriya blamed Ground Zero for the deaths of the civilians. He didn't have enough evidence to pass judgment. But he wasn't the only journalist asking questions, wondering the same thing on everyone's mind: had Ground Zero gone dark? Izuku didn't like to believe the worst about heroes, but he'd long ago realized that they operated on another level from everyday people, and especially quirkless people like himself. Groaning, Midoriya drained his coffee cup and stood, stretching out his back with a groan, shuffling across the floor to get another cup of coffee from the machine at the drink bar. Maybe he'd get something sweet this time. He could probably use the extra brain food, since his article just didn't seem to be coming together. He could probably justify blaming Ground Zero for that. He had other heroes to write about, but lately it seemed all everyone wanted to know was more about the disgraced hero. There was only so much information to be had. He was notoriously intense about work, and shared very little of his personal life with the public. Ground Zero didn't make many public appearances, and because of his abrasive personality, he didn't have many offers from companies who wanted him as their spokesperson. He was serious but also loud and careless. He fought like an animal without any consideration for the collateral damage his explosion quirk caused. He was unstable, a ticking time bomb. Sheet! Izuku hissed, dropping his coffee cup as he spilled the boiling hot liquid all over his hand. It was so early in the morning that no staff person seemed to have noticed. The one waitress he could see was moving like a zombie from table to table, wiping the flat surfaces mechanically. Awkwardly, Izuku picked up the cup, carrying it to the counter where the small sink sat next to the drink bar. Then he moved back over to the puddle, looking around awkwardly. Across the room, the waitress continued wiping tables. "Excuse me," he called softly, wanting to sink into the floor as he did so. Why was he such a disaster? How long does it take to outgrow your awkward years? He was 25, for F's sake. The waitress looked over from her table wiping and blinked slowly. In an instant, she straightened up, and it was like someone flipped a switch as she hurried over, a blinding smile on her face. "I'm so sorry, how can I help you?" "I dropped a cup, I'm so sorry," Izuku explained. "I didn't want anyone to slip on the coffee." "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience," the girl apologized profusely. "Please forgive me." Izuku brushed off her apologies. No, it's my fault, I was distracted, I'm very sorry." A few more apologies exchanged, and Izuku was back at his laptop with a sticky hand and no coffee. He stared at the screen for a long moment, hands hovering over the keyboard. The screen went dark. Dead battery. Screaming internally, Izuku closed his eyes and breathed for a moment. Then he packed up his computer, grabbed his check, and headed to the front where he quickly paid, and headed out along the sidewalk, taking a moment to soak in the sunlight just beginning to peek over the tops of the low buildings lining the street. He walked sedately in the direction of the train station, checking the time once he was close and deciding he might as well head into the office. So much for getting some work done early. At least he'd gotten to walk past a little park. The sunlight filtering through the trees and dappling the soft grass below almost made waking up so early worth the view. He was about to tuck his phone back in his pocket when it buzzed, startling him so badly he nearly dropped it. Who was texting him? He checked the time, 6 a.m. King Explodical. Hey. Izuku stared at the phone like it might bite his hand, all thoughts of getting into the office at a reasonable hour flying from his head. What the hell? He hissed to himself, dragging out the expletive for good measure. He opened the text, fingers hovering over the touchscreen. Izuku, what do you want? King Explodokill, Hachiko at Shibuya. Don't be late. Midoriya stared at his phone like it might bite him. What the hell? He said, this time much louder. Seriously, what? He shoved his phone into his pocket without answering, feeling unreasonably sad by the fact that he'd been commanded to join Ground Zero for coffee. The hero had refused to do a single interview since the incident, citing he had no time, despite being barred from half the emergency calls his agency picked up. The hero everyone was talking about was occupying himself by inviting random strangers out for coffee at 7 in the morning. Part of him wanted to say no, just to see how Ground Zero might react. Oh, but if his boss ever found out, he'd rip him a new one for avoiding the disgraced hero. His boss was always telling Izuku to chase down stories no matter where they might lead. But this wasn't even a story, it was just a Ground Zero and his DMN arrogance. It was the same arrogance Izuku had been forced to endure day after day for 3 long years at UA, watching the Heroics Department Class A do whatever the hell they wanted and get praised for it. Well, he was an adult now, and he didn't have to put up with that kind of shit. Ground Zero could go have coffee all by himself. Oh. His phone buzzed again. King Explodokill, do you want your DMN coffee or not? Izuku shut his eyes, resisting the urge to reply in an equally obnoxious tone. He was going to go to coffee with the pro hero and let Ground Zero treat him to the most expensive DMN coffee on the menu. And a scone. And anything else he wanted. And Ground Zero was going to pay for it all. Something about that felt right to Izuku. After all the trouble the explosive hero caused on a daily basis, refusing interviews and yet insisting on remaining in the public eye, maybe it was time he got what was coming to him. Smirking, Izuku pulled his phone back out of his pocket. Izuku, fine. You said 7? King Explodokill, yeah. Izuku, I'll be there. That taken care of, Midoriya checked to see how long it would take him to get to the center of Tokyo from the nearest station. If he hurried, he could probably get there a few minutes before 7. Midoriya shoved his hands deep in his pockets, turning and looking at the park with new eyes. Maybe he'd take another minute, or 10, to enjoy the scenery. It was a nice day for a walk after all. When Midoriya made it to the Hachiko entrance, he was reminded why he generally avoided Shibuya. Tourists and young people were all milling about in the large square, although not as many as would be here in a matter of hours. It was still early enough that the crush of humanity didn't feel quite smothering yet. However, when he reached the Hachiko statue, he discovered there was already a sizable crowd there, groups and individuals posing beside the dog statue. Smoke from the smokering area drifted on the wind, and Izuku wrinkled his nose. He didn't see the flashy pro hero anywhere, even though he'd only arrived 5 minutes behind schedule. Had he been had? Where was Ground Zero? Surely these people wouldn't be so excited by a dog statue when there was a real pro hero in their midst. Even if his reputation was in steep decline. Izuku dug into his pocket and pulled out his phone, suddenly paranoid that he might have somehow missed a message. There were no new messages, however. He frowned, tucking the phone back into his pocket, lifting his gaze to glance around again. "You're late," came a low growl from just behind his left ear. Midoriya yelped, spinning around, hands up in the air in the universal gesture of, "I surrender." His next breath caught in his throat at the sight of Ground Zero, in civilian clothes. What the hell? His face must have shown some confusion, because the hero sighed, tugging his sweatshirt hood lower over his face, further obscuring his features. Come on, if I were here in costume we'd be swamped by annoying groupies and you'd never get your coffee. He jerked his head in the direction of the scramble. Starbucks. Midoriya swallowed hard. Right? He agreed, feeling a little off balance. Ground Zero never had fan meetups and he never went to interviews out of uniform. The longest-running joke in the hero journalism world was that the pro hero didn't know how to dress in anything else. Which, to be fair, it almost looked like he didn't. His shirt was baggy and wrinkled. It draped over him like he'd just grabbed whatever was closest and shrugged it on. The hoodie he'd chosen was smaller, but he'd left it unzipped because it wasn't really that cold. The ripped skinny jeans had a suspicious stain on the thigh that Izuku didn't feel inclined to think too hard about. Without another word, Ground Zero spun on his heel, walking for the crosswalk. Midoriya trailed behind him, reeling. The pro hero looked exhausted. He hadn't been able to tell the night before because the dark mask cleverly concealed dark bags beneath the hero's eyes, and Ground Zero had always been pale, so of course no one had thought that something might be wrong. But something must be wrong because Ground Zero looked terrible. Midoriya was in a better position to know than most, seeing as he'd attended UA at the same time and all. He may not have been in the heroics department, but he'd made connections that had served him well, especially now that he mostly wrote about pro heroes. Most of them still thought of him as that nerd on the school newspaper, which was fine with him. Pro heroes rarely took the time to notice who authored the articles written about them anyway, and even if they had, Izuku had always opted to use an assumed name. There'd been several cases of pro-hero reporters getting kidnapped by villains and squeezed for information. Midoriya really wasn't about that life, so he wrote under the pseudonym Deku, an old nickname given to him by a long-forgotten childhood friend. The name had remained even as Izuku's memories of his childhood faded, and it was a sort of pun on his name. Besides, his friends had always teased him, saying he was pro-hero trash, as if being an obsessive nerd was a bad thing. Joke was on them anyway. He turned his nerdy, borderline stalkerish fixation into a high-paying career. Take that, haters. Izuku was so caught up in thought he didn't realize Ground Zero had drawn up short until he stumbled into him. Oh, sorry, Izuku apologized quickly. Ground Zero? Or should he call him Bakugu since he wasn't in uniform? Just grunted in response. Izuku peered around his broad shoulders to see that Starbucks was packed. What on earth could all these people be doing in Shibuya at 7 a.m. on a weekday? It boggled the mind. Bakugu tugged anxiously at his sweatshirt hood. Izuku knew why immediately. There were a ton of people here, and he couldn't possibly be the only obsessive hero stalker in Tokyo. Plus, Bakugu was fairly recognizable, even with his wild hair hidden and his vermilion eyes shrouded by the shadow of his hood. DMN, Bakugu grumbled, turning to Izuku. This might take a while. A Starbucks employee walked up to them with a menu. Would you like one? She asked, proffering it to Bakugu, who took it with a grunt. Not that Izuku was expecting much. The girl didn't seem to recognize the hero out of uniform, though, and Izuku could see Bakugu's shoulders slump as he relaxed slightly. He extended the menu to Izuku. You know what you want? Izuku shrugged, reaching for the menu. Is this just coffee, or could I get something to eat too? He asked, trying to sound casual but secretly expecting the pro hero to get pissy, just because that was something that high school Bakugu probably would have done. Instead, the hero sighed like he'd been expecting something to that effect. Sure, whatever, he agreed. Izuku glanced at him in surprise. What really? Bakugu narrowed his eyes at him. Why'd you ask if you expected me to say no? He demanded, a growl to his voice like he didn't actually want to know the answer. To PSS you off, Izuku didn't say. Instead, his conscience got the better of him. If I order something to eat, will you eat something too? The hero's eyes widened like he hadn't expected that. Izuku hadn't really expected it either, except that Bakugu was pale and his eyes had dark circles under them. Maybe Izuku always ended up falling into the role of mom friend, but was that really such a bad thing? Although Bakugu could probably do without Izuku's motherly advances, if the look on his face was any indication. Then Bakugu sighed again, his expression softening incrementally. Yeah, sure, I guess, he agreed, surprisingly amenable. Midoriya blinked hard. It couldn't possibly be that easy to get a breakfast interview with Ground Zero. And we'll eat together, he clarified. Ground Zero looked at him like he'd sprouted antennae in the last 5 seconds. Why the F else would we both buy food? I'm not going to make you sit at a completely different table, what the F dash? That was a fair point, now that Izuku thought about it. Alright, then I want the egg croissant, he told Bakugo, handing the menu back. And a soy milk la with dash. If it's going to be that FING complicated you can order it for yourself, Ground Zero interrupted him. Just tell me when to fork over the cash. Midoriya wasn't sure whether to feel insulted or ashamed. He settled for insulted, mostly because this was Bakugo. Fine, he pointedly looked away from Ground Zero. The hero sighed beside him. Fine, he agreed. Midoriya sighed too. He was already regretting this. Bakugo was caught between trying to make sure no one at the Starbucks recognized him and also trying to puzzle out the fucker he was buying coffee. The guy had a frizzy mop of green hair, and unlike most people he didn't seem starstruck. Nor did he seem to think Bakugo was a murderer, as had been more Katsuki's experience lately. However, the guy seemed to be pressing, trying to see how far he could push Bakugo before Bakugo would push back. It was such a weird dynamic, since Bakugo's quirk was usually enough to keep people off his back. But this guy didn't seem to feel at all threatened by Bakugo or his quirk. What made him so special, huh? Did he have some sort of invulnerability quirk? Was that why Bakugo couldn't seem to intimidate him? It probably had more to do with the green-haired guy knowing that Bakugo would give his identity away if he used his quirk here. How annoying. Being in public while hiding his identity so as not to cause a big fuss wasn't really Katsuki's style, and it felt weird. But that wasn't the only thing that felt off about all this. The green guy was acting so confident, so familiar, almost like he knew Katsuki. But how the hell was that possible? Katsuki would have remembered a guy with such ridiculous hair and freckles. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he should know the guy with the green hair. It was almost like the guy knew something he wasn't saying. Or maybe he was just set at Bakugo for making him buy a coffee the day before, and was treating him so casually because he was confident that Bakugo wouldn't blow him up after going to the effort of replacing his coffee. As if it was a crime to make someone buy you a coffee. Although, now that he considered it, the guy probably could have reported him for an abuse of power or something. Katsuki dismissed the thought immediately. Sure, he'd bullied a can of coffee from the guy. So what? Katsuki had been running so far past empty fumes, didn't even cover it. People should be grateful he hadn't ripped the vending machine apart with his bare hands. He felt a sharp elbow jab his side. Motherfuck dash, he began, turning to the green-haired guy, who was giving him a look. You gotta order, he told Katsuki, and then pay for our stuff. After being treated so rudely, Katsuki had half a mind to just stomp off and leave him with the bill. But one look at the other's face told him that not only did Greenie know exactly what he was thinking, but he would definitely find some way to make him regret the decision. Bakugo turned to the cashier. Gimme the strongest, blackest, nastiest brew you got, he demanded. Oh, and the same breakfast sandwich that this nerd ordered, he added, jerking his head in the direction of Green Mop. Green Mop looked at him with a fleeting expression of insult, followed by a look of resigned exasperation. That's right, weird nerd, know your fucking place, Katsuki thought viciously, absently forking over the cash and taking his tray with the breakfast sandwich from the cashier. He turned to survey the shop. There didn't seem to be a single table open, even at 7 a.m. in the DM morning. Green Mop jabbed him in the ribs again. There's a table about to open up by the window, he said. I'll wait here for our coffees, can you go save our seats? Bakugo hated being told what to do, and was about to tell the green guy exactly where he could shove his suggestions when the nerd added, You weren't paying attention to my order, so I figured you wouldn't know which one was mine. I mean, it was true, he had no idea what the weirdo had ordered, but still. To just assume that Bakugo hadn't been paying attention. There was no point in arguing, and Bakugo wanted a place to sit anyway, so he hurried across the floor, headed for the table where a couple were just gathering up their coffees and their bags. He wound his way through the cafe, setting his tray down on the table before the two had even left. They stared at him, and the young man frowned. Isn't that rather rude of you? He accused, edging out of his seat and reaching to grip the elbow of the young woman he was with. Katsuki shrugged, flopping down into the comfortable chair the man had just vacated. "Don't care," he answered dismissively. The couple sniffed and hurried off. Green Nerd seemed to materialize behind him. "You didn't have to chase them off," he chided, sliding his own tray onto the low table and picking up one of the 2 coffees, placing it on Katsuki's tray. "Here's your drink," he said. He sat down in the other chair, glancing out the window, his eyes lighting up. "What a nice view," he exclaimed, then turned to Bakugo. "So should I call you King Explodo-Kill, or?" As much as that would please Katsuki, he figured it might call too much attention to them. "You can call me Bakugo," he told the Green Nerd. "Bakugo," he repeated, green eyes sparkling with mirth. "I guess Explodo-Kill isn't particularly far off, is it?" He chuckled, then added, "I'm Midoriya." Your name is literally green and you're making fun of my name?" Katsuki scoffed. Midoriya shrugged, ignoring the comment. "Why'd you invite me to coffee?" he asked, sipping his fancy pants drink and raising his eyebrows in Katsuki's direction. "I needed to pay you back," Bakugo explained. "I don't like owing people shit." Midoriya glanced down at the breakfast, then back at Bakugo. "This is a lot more than a can coffee," he commented. "Yeah, well, that's to make up for the inconvenience of seeing my sorry but FNG losing my sheet at a DMN vending machine," Katsuko explained, "and I guess thanks for not just getting the F out of there." A thought occurred to him then, a frown creasing his features as he sipped his coffee. Disgusting. But caffeinated, which is all that Katsuki really wanted from his coffee these days. "Why didn't you run?" he asked. "Haven't you seen the news lately?" Midoriya shrugged, taking a bite of his egg croissant and chewing thoughtfully before responding. "I'm not easily swayed by the court of public opinion," he answered, that gave Bakugo a hard look. "Should I have run?" Katsuki didn't have an honest answer for that. "Hell, sometimes I want to run away from me," he managed, trying not to sound as goddamn sick and tired as he felt. If the look on the nerd's face was any indication, he hadn't succeeded. Midoriya shrugged. "Fair," he commented, taking another bite of breakfast sandwich. "So, if you don't mind my asking I'm not going to talk about that night," Katsuki interrupted, his stomach churning at the thought. Midoriya looked confused, then his eyes widened in understanding. "Oh no, I didn't mean he sputtered for a moment. "I was just going to ask why you look like sheet." Katsuki blinked. "Pardon?" Midoriya shrugged, indicating the table. "You obviously don't care what people think of you in your private life, and all I've heard about he lowered his voice conspiratorially, "Ground Zero, makes it look like you don't really care what people think of you in your public life either. Even the really negative public opinion you're dealing with now probably doesn't bother you much, right?" He gazed at Katsuki expectantly, his green eyes sharp and calculating. "Holy shit." Bakugo took a sip of his coffee, mentally re-evaluating Midoriya. He wasn't just a nerd, he was a perceptive nerd. He'd need to be careful about what he said around him. "I've been working a lot of overtime," he said, answering Midoriya's first question without touching the second. "Less sleep, fewer regular meals, more physical impact, add it all up and, well, I end up looking like sheet." Midoriya was eyeing him thoughtfully. Bakugo felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Was this guy reading his mind? Was he like that fucker Shinso? "What's your quirk?" he asked suddenly. Midoriya's eyebrows jumped up towards his hairline, but at least he wasn't studying Bakugo so closely anymore. "Oh," he said weakly, a strange look crossing his features, and then, "I don't have one." "The F-?" "You don't have one," Bakugo repeated disbelievingly. How could someone be so confident around a pro-hero like him without a quirk? What the hell? Midoriya grinned ruefully. "I guess the quirk skipped a generation," he shrugged. "Mom and Dad had them, but not me." He spread his hands demonstratively. "What you see is what you get." Bakugo doubted that was the case, which he indicated by wrinkling his nose and making a non-committal, There was definitely more to Midoriya than met the eye, he just hadn't figured out what, yet. He would figure it out eventually. Was he actually planning on seeing this nerd again? Midoriya grinned at Bakugo. "It takes most people by surprise," he commented, especially since I went to UA. Katsuki choked on his coffee. You, he wheezed, you went to UA? Midoriya looked like he wanted to help Katsuki with his choking, but also didn't want to make him uncomfortable by touching him. Instead, he sat back and waited until Bakugo's coughing fit had subsided to explain. I was in general studies, he explained. I mean, it's not like I could get into the heroics department without a quirk. Bakugo nodded slowly, mind whirling. Maybe he did know the green nerd. He seemed about Katsuki's age. What year? Same year as you, Midoriya answered, sipping his coffee, a small smirk on his features. Don't worry about not remembering me, I was a nobody. Bakugo wasn't worried about that. General studies was all a bunch of useless losers who weren't good enough to make it, at least in his books. But you remembered me, Bakugo said. Obviously, you always stood out, Midoriya commented blithely. It's hard to miss a walking bag of DS. Katsuki was on his feet before his brain quite caught up with him. What the F, did you just call me? He snarled. Midoriya sipped his coffee, nonplussed. Bag? He raised an eyebrow, giving Katsuki a look. Tell me you're at least self-aware enough to know you were a giant a-hole. Katsuki was half tempted to turn and walk out of the Starbucks and never look back. Another part of him couldn't believe a quirkless loser had the nerve to talk to him that way. What the F dash? Sit down, Midoriya said exasperatedly. People are staring. I thought you wanted to stay incognito. He rolled his eyes. Don't be a child, it's been 8 years since high school. I'm sure you've matured since then. Midoriya looked at him strangely. I mean, you're not still a bag of DS, are you? Katsuki wanted to vehemently deny it, but his public persona definitely fit within the sphere of dickish, if not a whole bag. He sat down. I'm not, he said, taking a sip of coffee and focusing on breathing calmly. I guess not, Midoriya hummed in agreement. Now you're just an a-hole. Katsuki nearly spat out his coffee. What the sheet? Katsuki fought to keep his voice low. In what way? Midoriya set his coffee down, barking a single sharp laugh. You really aren't self-aware enough to figure it out, he breathed, voice tinged with amusement. He leaned forward, setting his cup of coffee down. Let me put it another way. You literally shook me down for 200 yen yesterday, and you have the audacity to presume that buying me a cup of coffee and a croissant makes it all better. Doesn't it? Katsuki asked, trying not to feel set off. He didn't get it. He bought Midoriya even better coffee than a can, he even bought him food. Why was he still so upset? What did the fucker want more coffee? Then he'd buy him more coffee if dash. I'll buy you more coffee, he snapped. Midoriya leaned back, blinking slowly. He studied Katsuki with his deep green eyes, a knowing look crossing his features. Oh, he said quietly. He frowned a little. You understand why that's not good enough, right? You can't just throw money at your problems and expect them to go away. The F dash? Katsuki scowled at him. I don't throw money at my problems, he snarled, fingers flexing pointedly. I explode them. Katsuki was getting tired of the way Midoriya refused to react to his threats. It was almost like he was used to being threatened. Quirkless losers probably were used to being threatened all the time. No wonder it hadn't worked on him. The green loser was probably threatened by some overpowered quirk user every DMN day of his FING life. Midoriya seemed to read his mind again, face twitching with just a hint of a smirk. Now you're starting to get it, he said. You've never been in a position where you couldn't just say, no, or F off, or explode your way out of an uncomfortable position. Bullshit. There were plenty of things that Katsuki hadn't been able to get out of, and lots of times he'd felt like he wasn't strong enough, skilled enough, fast enough. Like that night he'd cheat, abort that F dash, he didn't want his brain going there right now. That's not fair, Katsuki argued. I've had to work my butt off to get to where I am now, you don't get to tell me dash. And you, Midoriya had the ball to interrupt him mid-sentence, don't get to tell me how, or when, or why to feel violated, or that you have any right to decide when you've done enough to make it up to me. He smiled then. The coffee was nice, though, and I do appreciate it. His green eyes snapped with something dark as he continued, "Just don't threaten me with physical violence ever again." For the first time in a long time, Katsuki was at a loss for words. Midoriya could see the wheels turning in Bakugo's head as his words processed. Bakugo didn't know how to deal in anything but physical violence and threats, so Midoriya's demand was probably trapped in the does not compute area of the pro-hero's brain. He shouldn't have expected anything better from the hero who could level entire city districts while fighting a villain. He didn't know how to communicate, except through threats and rough language. No wonder the public despised him. How could anyone believe that someone so coarse and belligerent hadn't killed 2 innocent civilians in the line of duty? It almost made a sick sense that of all the heroes to kill someone in the crossfire, it would be Ground Zero. But Midoriya was not so easily convinced. He'd seen Bakugo in action way back in UA. Even before his rookie career, he'd taken extensive notes on him, written school newspaper articles about him, even begged for a few interviews. Unfortunately, the only quotes he ever got were not publishable due to, well, excessive profanity. The one thing that had remained consistent was that, for all his bluster, the hero had never actively disfigured a student or injured them beyond recovery, and despite demonstrating beyond a doubt that he absolutely could kill someone, he hadn't. Not even when his quirk had been more volatile, harder to control. Now that he was a pro, he definitely had managed a level of finesse and control greater than he'd had before, and while he did damage city blocks, he managed to contain collateral damage to structures, not lives. Being a reporter whose job involved stalking heroes and taking incredibly detailed notes on even the most inconsequential of minutiae, Izuku knew better than most that Ground Zero had impeccable control over his explosions. If only he were willing to exert that same level of control over his temper. Across from him, Bakugo took another sip of his coffee, making a face, setting it down with a low growl. He sighed gustily, scarlet eyes raking over Midoriya like he was trying to mentally dissect him. Squinting slightly, Bakugo opened his mouth and paused as though thinking better of what he was about to say before finally speaking. "Define threats of physical violence," he grated out begrudgingly. It took Izuku by surprise. He hadn't anticipated the pro-hero giving serious consideration to what he'd requested. In fact, he'd mostly expected a FU and a dramatic exit from the pro-hero. In almost the same instant, he felt disappointed in himself. For all his talk about how he'd expected the hero to have grown up, apparently he still expected Ground Zero to behave like the entitled teen he'd once known. It wasn't very fair, was it? And in his own way, Bakugo seemed to be trying, so Midoriya gave the demand for specificity a moment's thought before responding. "What I meant was, don't threaten to use your quirk, or physical strength, to injure me," Midoriya explained, not entirely sure why the hero needed more XPLCT details to what he'd assumed was a pretty basic request. Respecting someone enough to not threaten them with physical violence wasn't exactly hard for most people, but then, Bakugo wasn't most people. Don't say you're going to, explode me or dismember me or whatever you say when you try to intimidate people. Don't do it. As if the very idea was a foreign concept, the pro-hero scowled in a mixture of irritation and bewilderment. 2 blinks later, he was making a face that indicated Midoriya had demanded something heinous of him. He finally snapped, "That's like telling me to wear a GE. A pained look crossed his features. "I don't mean that I fucking intend anything malicious when I threaten you, it's just," he sighed exasperatedly, "I don't know, Red Riot says that insults are my love language, so logistically speaking, the longer we're in each other's company, the more likely I am to say I'm gonna burn your FNG face off, but it's not." He struggled to find the right words, face twisting as he searched. "Personal," was the phrase he finally settled on. Midoriya considered this for a moment. The pro-hero was notorious for his abrasive personality, even now, so it made sense that his violent tendencies from high school would remain at least somewhat present. He sighed. "How about a compromise? If you threaten me, I walk away and you get to think about why I checked out of the conversation." Bakugo considered this for a long moment, taking another sip of coffee and grimacing. "Fine," he barked. "But you have to tell me why you're leaving so I don't assume every time you don't answer me it's because I offended your fucking delicate sensibilities." Midoriya nodded, figuring he'd wait for another day to address the fact that not wanting to be physically intimidated or threatened was just a common social expectation and not really a delicate sensibility. Deal. Bakugo nodded curtly, sipping his coffee again. He still hadn't touched his food, Izuku realized. Nodding at it pointedly, Izuku raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you going to eat that?" he asked. The hero curled his lip in displeasure, waving a hand dismissively. "I had a protein shake this morning, I'm fine." He didn't look fine, though. With a frown, Izuku protested, "But you shouldn't waste it, and I'm sure with you working extra hours you need to keep your strength up." Bakugo raised an eyebrow slowly. "Do I look like I'm asking for your opinion? Are you a FING personal trainer or nutritionist? Why the F should I eat just because you made me buy a goddamn sandwich?" Izuku scowled. "Well, you still look like sheet, so maybe a croissant would do you some good." "It's a calorie bomb of fat and carbs." Ground Zero snapped. "Why would I do that to myself?" "Because you look like sheet and coffee is not a meal," Izuku snapped. "Besides, you already bought it, just eat it. Who cares if it's not as healthy as a protein shake? It's just this once." He stared pointedly at the pro. Hero, suddenly all too aware of how gaunt the hero looked. Like he hadn't been eating. Like he'd been running himself ragged. Like maybe he was more bothered by the civilian deaths than he liked to pretend. With a scowl that spoke volumes, Bakugo shoved the entire croissant into his mouth at once. "There," he mumbled furiously around the mouthful. "Happy? Now shut the F up." A piece of egg flew from his mouth and landed on the tray. Izuku sighed. "Must you insist on behaving like a petulant child?" Ground Zero was still chewing, but his eyes sparked with a fiery retort. He swallowed. "F you," he snarled, chugging down the rest of his coffee and glancing at his watch. "I gotta go." "Stay out of trouble," he added, turning and walking away just like that, leaving Izuku with the dirty dishes on the tray and possibly even more questions than he'd had before agreeing to meet for coffee. What a weird way to bid a person farewell to. "Stay out of trouble?" Midoriya repeated after Bakugo's vanishing figure. "What's that supposed to mean?" Izuku got into the office a little later than his boss would have preferred, but since there hadn't been any big villain attacks or pressing interviews for him to get to, he wasn't really in any trouble. After making himself as comfortable as possible in his hard, squeaky computer chair at his wobbly desk in the dark corner of the office, Midoriya got to work. He had never really taken great interest in Ground Zero before, at least, no more interest than he had in any other UA alumni who'd graduated at the same time he did. His beat sometimes took him to sites where Ground Zero had left behind his signature, smoking craters and damaged property everywhere. But since the hero was notorious for not giving interviews, it wasn't as though Izuku had ever really had the chance to interact with him face to face, at least not since high school. Izuku was curious now, though, and he began looking through the compiled footage of Ground Zero that the company had collected since he'd gone pro, not entirely sure what he was trying to find. He was really looking for more information about that awful civilian tragedy from 10 days ago. He just wasn't being honest with himself about it, yet. As he began scanning the hero stats that the company collected, he noticed an interesting, if concerning, trend in Ground Zero stats. He'd been steadily upping his hours in the time since the incident in. Izuku blinked hard, not sure he'd actually seen where the incident took place. He frowned. Shouldn't it be common knowledge? But then, the incident was technically still under investigation, so perhaps that's why there wasn't much information available to the media just yet. With a little bit of digging, Izuku found the original notes from their crime reporter, who had just happened to be in the area that night. Since hero and crime reporting tended to run in similar circles, Izuku had let Matsukawa take lead on the story. After all, he'd found it first, and it wasn't like Izuku was desperate to find more information on Ground Zero. At least, he hadn't been looking less than 2 weeks ago. Now it felt almost personal. The incident had taken place in a nice neighborhood somewhere near Setagaya. According to Matsukawa's notes, 2 killed, 1 hospitalized, the house was ablaze, and Ground Zero had been the only hero on the scene. The only survivor reportedly blamed the hero for the blaze just before losing consciousness, and as Izuku dug deeper into the story, it sounded like he had fallen into a coma. So it was the word of a civilian against the word of a pro-hero, and 2 innocent lives had been lost. What Izuku found more interesting was that Ground Zero had been silent, and while Matsukawa had made just a quick note that the hero seemed dazed and quiet, only answering questions in hushed tones, it was obvious that the crime reporter had not recognized how out of character that behavior was for Ground Zero. Unbidden, Midoriya saw in his mind's eye the stricken look that had crossed Bakugo's face when he thought Izuku was asking about that night. He hadn't been at that time, but now Izuku wanted to ask. He scowled then, staring disapprovingly at the stats that had sent him off on this tangent in the first place. When was he supposed to get time to ask Ground Zero anything? Ever since that night, the hero had taken on extra shifts to the point where he hadn't actually had a day off in what looked like 10 days straight, working doubles and clocking out with just enough time to sleep. How the hell was he surviving such a punishing schedule? Izuku wondered absently before remembering how exhausted and generally unwell the hero had looked at Starbucks. Maybe he wasn't surviving. Izuku scowled. Especially not if he was subsisting entirely on protein shakes. He narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. He needed to get a bit more information about Ground Zero before he started poking around, and he didn't want Bakugo getting suspicious. He smirked a little, glancing at his phone. Maybe it was time to get in touch with a few of his old friends from UA. Quirk or no, he was still DMing good at his job, and part of that involved having contacts in all areas of hero work. He scrolled through his contact list, spotting one name in particular that he thought might have some useful information to help flesh out what the hell was going on with Bakugo behind the mask. Izuku began texting rapidly, a smirk crawling across his features. Life was about to get much more interesting and soon. Bakugo cursed under his breath. The green mop had made him late, him and his bright eyes and his sharp tongue and his asinine expressions that made Katsuki want to do what he asked, even when he wasn't even hungry. And now he was going to be late, and how was he supposed to excuse his tardiness? Sorry boss, I was on a coffee date. You know how it is, gotta celebrate being alive when 2 innocents are fing dead because I... Whirling suddenly, Katsuki struck the nearest wall, not using his quirk, but he was still strong enough to make a loud noise and startle everyone in the vicinity. He couldn't keep thinking about that night, it was already haunting his sleep, he sure as hell couldn't allow it to invade his waking hours. Round face, or Uravity, he should probably at least try to remember her hero name, kept insisting he go see a shrink. Bakugo scoffed under his breath. Like that was ever going to happen. Convulsively tugging his sweatshirt hood even lower over his face. He shoved his way through the crowds at Shibuya Station, taking the steps up to his train 2 at a time, stumbling onto the platform just as the bell began to ring, indicating the doors were about to close. Unwilling to stand around on the platform any longer than absolutely necessary, Katsuki sped across the platform, jamming his way onto the nearest car, which was already packed full. The door tried to slide closed, caught on someone's heel, and reopened. Everyone in the car shuffled together a little tighter and the doors closed, leaving the car full of working professionals in suits, students, and the occasional street-clothed individual like Katsuki, all sharing a precious small amount of space and steaming up the windows of the train at an alarming rate. Unable to reach an overhead bar or hanging grip, Katsuki merely braced himself against the salarymen crowded around him as best he could, enduring the crush of humanity. It was only a few stops to his office from here, he could take it. 3 stops later, and Katsuki was already regretting the coffee date. Commuter traffic SCD. That's why he usually went into work on an earlier train, so he didn't have to deal with the sheet, he thought, scowling as more people shoved into the already packed car. Honestly, Tokyo. Finally, he arrived at his station, shoving his way off like a man possessed, taking the steps 2 at a time going down as well, busting out onto the street and speed-walking for the back entrance to his office where most heroes came in. With his street clothes, it would have looked strange for him to walk in the front door, and like most heroes, he didn't like to advertise what he looked like out of costume. He stomped his way in, heading straight for the lockers to retrieve his uniform as he was supposed to be in a meeting or some sheet before going out on patrol. At least Green Guy, Midoriya, hadn't made him miss any actual action, just annoying people talking about useless sheet. Katsuki never really cared about the paperwork part of being a hero, but it was mandatory, so he just liked to get it over with as soon as possible. Leaving his street clothes balled up in a locker, Katsuki stomped his way up to his division, scowling as he saw his roommate making obnoxious gestures across the office at him. Kirishima was waving his hands around as if to say, "What's wrong with you?" without actually saying anything. Beyond him, Katsuki spotted half and half watching him with narrowed eyes, shaking his head as if in disapproval. Well, if him, he'd been taking the last few patrols off to recover from some bullshit injury, which was why Katsuki had taken on double shifts. It was a shitty show of gratitude he was getting from Endeavor's embarrassing offspring, nothing but a blank stare and 2 furrowed eyebrows. "What?" Katsuki groused, stomping over. Kirishima looked at Todoroki. Todoroki continued his blank stare. "This is an intervention," the hero better known as Shuto said blandly. "Go sleep." He inclined his head, indicating one of the many break rooms they had stocked specifically for heroes who needed a nap between shifts or were on call in the coordination center. "Why the F would I do that?" Katsuki demanded irritably. "I'm already late for the meeting." Kirishima coughed lightly, a faint blush dusting his cheeks as he scratched the back of his head. "Yeah, about that." The meeting was the intervention, Shuto informed him dispassionately. Kaminari, Uraraka, Azui, and Ida were here earlier, but they had to get back to their respective agencies. His gaze told Katsuki exactly how displeased he was with having arranged a meeting with his former classmates only to have the intended target of the meeting never show up. Katsuki had changed his mind. He was incredibly grateful to the Green Mop for making him late. Coffee was a hell of a lot less infuriating than being forced to listen to a bunch of assholes talk about how they were worried about him. "That's what you FNG get for trying to spring an intervention on me," Katsuki snarled, then whirled on Kirishima. "I ain't into intervention, man." "Seriously?" Kirishima's countenance darkened. It didn't happen often, but when it did, even Katsuki took a step back. "You're not eating, you're not sleeping, you still haven't gone to a mandatory casualty counseling session?" "Yes. Bakugo, mandatory. It's in the DMN contract you signed to get into this agency." Kirishima was getting himself worked up, and Katsuki needed to distract him, fast. "I ate this morning," Katsuki interrupted him. "A croissant breakfast sandwich." "Hell yes, another reason to appreciate Broccoli Head's coffee shop meddling." Kirishima paused, eyeing Katsuki strangely as though a thought had just occurred to him. "You mean you weren't avoiding us because you heard about the intervention?" he asked in a small voice. "Don't get me wrong," Katsuki said. "I would have absolutely avoided it if I'd known about it. But I didn't know, I was just having coffee with Dash." He cut himself off, trying to figure out how to classify the green nerd. A random citizen? A guy he'd menaced in a passage leading to the Tokyo Metro? A passing acquaintance? A weak but quirkless nerd who insisted that he eat breakfast? He'd spent too long trying to figure out which words to say, and now both Kirishima and Todoroki were eyeing him thoughtfully. "Bakugo," Todoroki said matter-of-factly, "were you on a date?" Once the screaming finally died down to a dull roar, Todoroki tried to explain. "It could have been a platonic friendship date, I wasn't implying Dash." "Bullshit." Ground Zero snarled, still practically smoking from his ears. "You meant it like you said it, and I'm telling you it's not effing like that." Todoroki nodded calmly. "I believe you. What the f do I have to do to convince you it wasn't a FNG date?" Bakugo bellowed, still trying to bluster and deny something that Todoroki literally couldn't care less about. God, his coworkers could be annoying sometimes. "You don't have to Dash," Todoroki began, but Bakugo continued as if he hadn't spoken. "I don't do dates, I'm the farthest thing from romantic." "I'm not about to argue that point," Todoroki agreed. "F you," Bakugo replied, making an obscene gesture in his direction. There was no winning when Bakugo was like this, Todoroki reflected. Was it coffee with a friend, then? Perhaps he'd substituted one intervention for another, if whoever it was had gotten him to eat solid food. Kirishima had indicated that Bakugo had been subsisting on nothing but protein shakes for the last week. "No," Bakugo replied sharply, though he appeared to be winding down finally. "Just some a-hole." As far as Todoroki could tell, This was Bakugu's way of referring to literally anyone who had ever walked the face of the earth. Still, Shudo had little to no interest in Bakugu's personal life, and he had no intent to press the matter. He'd done this for Kirishima, and out of concern for his agency's reputation, not Bakugu. The two of them were co-workers, but they'd also been school rivals. Frankly speaking, Todoroki had always found Bakugu's temperament off-putting, even on the best of days. "It's nice that you went out to coffee," Kirishima said excitedly, all too eager to hear about Bakugu's socializing. One of his largest concerns had been Bakugu's intentional self-isolation, and he seemed thrilled to hear that Bakugu had willingly seen and interacted with another human being. Todoroki mentally offered whoever it was his deepest condolences. "Yeah," Bakugu said, and Todoroki could hear the eye roll in his voice, even if Bakugu managed to keep his features schooled into a more neutral for Bakugu scowl. The coffee was gross, the company grosser. Again, Todoroki felt his heart go out to the poor soul who'd found it in them to willingly spend time with a sleep-deprived Bakugu. As far as he was concerned, Kirishima was a saint for putting up with him as long as he had. "Anybody we know?" Kirishima was asking, and Todoroki glanced over, curious. He couldn't imagine Bakugu having any friends outside their UA alumni group. Bakugu had been something of a loner when he got into UA, and it had mostly been Kirishima and Denki's efforts that had drawn him into begrudging friendship with the rest of Class A. "Just some guy who used to go to UA," Bakugu grumbled, and Todoroki leaned back, satisfied. Of course it was someone from UA, his explosive colleague lived and breathed the hero lifestyle. He never had time for anything but training and hero work. Todoroki thought it was a uniquely miserable way to live one's life, but Bakugu wouldn't want to hear that from him no matter how true it may have been. "What guy?" Kirishima pressed. "I don't know, some fucking that green nerd," Bakugu snapped. "It wasn't a FING date and we're never going to see each other again. Get off my back." Kirishima raised his hands in a gesture of lock surrender. Okay, I get it, you don't want to talk about the nerdy green guy." Bakugu scowled. "But are we FNG done here?" he demanded, glancing between Todoroki and Kirishima pointedly. "Just don't be late to your next intervention," Todoroki suggested with a little smirk. Bakugu made an obscene gesture and stomped off. Todoroki and Kirishima watched him go. "Ah," Kirishima commented a moment later, "I forgot to tell him we still had intervention cookies in the break room." Midoriya stared glumly at his screen, currently occupied by a fifth nondescript apology email that basically boiled down to, "Yeah, Ground Zero is an a-hole, but if he did kill somebody it was probably an accident." He'd gone so far as to get in touch with long-shot sources, and this hero in particular tended to be quite taciturn, even when he wasn't being pressed for details about tragic incidents by nosy reporters. But none of his other sources had been able to give him anything on Bakugu, whereas this email. It wasn't much, just one line. Even Red Riot wasn't able to get him to talk, and he hasn't seen a professional to talk about the incident yet. Midoriya scowled deeper at the email. Red Riot was probably one of the few people who could get through to Ground Zero. The two had quickly become fast friends at a time when others in UA's Class 1A couldn't stand to be around Bakugu. Ask anyone around, and they'd have told you the student with a hardening quirk had one of the softest hearts, soft enough to even reach someone as vicious and volatile as Bakugu. Midoriya pinched his lips together in displeasure, considering what it must mean for Bakugu to be withdrawing even from his best friend. Surely he couldn't have. But he couldn't ignore the evidence spread out before him. Evidence he and his co-workers had collected over time, scenes of horrific destruction, of buildings leveled, streets buckling, sinkholes, rubble. True, no one had been injured in these incidents, but the fact remained that Ground Zero could level buildings easily. He could maim or grievously injure someone with a snap of his fingers. He could murder, Izuku admitted wearily. Most heroes could, if he were being honest with himself. But most heroes weren't blatantly misanthropic with outsized anger issues and an almost comical need to be the best at everything. But did all that make Ground Zero a killer? A bad personality was just that. It wasn't an indication of guilt, just obnoxious. But why was Ground Zero being so dim and quiet about it all? He was loud and outspoken, he was demanding and had a forceful personality. He didn't seem the type to allow suspicions or slights against his character to remain unchallenged for so long. But not only had he avoided discussing the incident, even if only to deny any wrongdoing, he also hadn't spoken to any of the people close to him about it, at least, not that he could tell. It was worrying to say the least. If Bakugo refused to talk to a psychologist, even refused to open up to his best friend, who could he open up to? Was he burying it, bottling up his emotions? He didn't seem the type to swallow his indignity, or grit his teeth and bear the weight of heightened public scrutiny without saying a word to defend himself. If he wasn't talking, how would he work through the complex emotions of watching two innocents die, possibly at your own hands? Midoriya scowled at the email again, a glum wariness settling over him as he contemplated the enigma Bakugo was turning out to be. Even Red Riot wasn't able to get him to talk. If Kirishima couldn't get through to his own former classmate, who could? Hey, Midoriya. Matsukawa Shinji leaned against the flimsy cubicle wall like he had no reason to fear imminent collapse, even though he'd definitely knocked one over by accident not 2 weeks earlier. A brave soul, Izuku decided, turning to face his coworker with a half-grin. That cubicle wall won't hold forever, he warned the older man. Matsukawa ran a hand through his dark brown hair with a good-natured chuckle. He was a handsome man in his early 30s, with none of the baby-faced features that Midoriya struggled to compensate for during interviews. He looked sharp in his crisp suit, eyeglasses framing his dark, piercing eyes. Sure. He pushed off the wall, gesturing to Midoriya's computer. You had a question? Izuku nodded, scooting out the chair he kept in the corner for occasions such as these, before explaining further. It's about the Ground Zero incident, Midoriya said, and Matsukawa's eyes widened a little, his eyebrows jumping in surprise. Really now? Matsukawa settled down on the spare chair, eyeing Izuku with new interest. What do you want to know? What did you see? Midoriya demanded. That night when you first got there, I mean. Matsukawa nodded to acknowledge he'd heard Midoriya, falling silent for a moment. The ambulance had already taken the 2 victims and the 1 survivor, Matsukawa said finally. Ground Zero was wrapped up in one of those shock blankets. He gestured as if wrapping a blanket around his shoulders, hunching up miserably. Izuku couldn't even begin to imagine seeing Ground Zero looking like that, but Matsukawa had no reason to lie about it. These details hadn't even been in the final article. Go on, he encouraged, as Matsukawa's pause dragged on. He was pale, probably paler than usual. He looked ready to pass out. Matsukawa frowned, trying to remember. The paramedics were pulling out equipment to check him out. He made a token protest dash. What kind of protest? Midoriya interrupted. Did he shout? That would be much more in character than hunching, he thought. No yelling, his coworker answered. He just, when you sort of shrink away from someone's touch? Kenneth made himself smaller. Matsukawa rubbed his forehead, frowning with concentration. He was saying something too, but he glanced at Izuku. This is just my best guess, he said quickly, and you know how the boss feels about unreliable sources, but dash. He leaned in closer, and Izuku edged towards him, wondering what could possibly demand such a strong disclaimer. Matsukawa's dark eyes were hidden behind his lenses, reflecting the glare of harsh fluorescent lights overhead as he whispered. The guy was muttering, I killed them. I'm sorry, so sorry, they're dead and I killed them. Matsukawa made a face, leaning back again, gazing at Izuku seriously. Now, mind you, I wasn't close enough to hear for sure, and couldn't get a recording, but, he shrugged. Then the cops and the lawyers were all over me saying it was an active crime scene, blah blah blah. You know the drill dash, Midoriya nodded. He did know what it was like. I thought about looking into it a bit more, but with the interviews I got from some bystanders and one of the crime scene technicians I had enough for my story. Besides, what I overheard was technically off the record, and we all know how generous Ground Zero is with his interviews. I wasn't likely to get an official quote from him, and since I wasn't positive of what I'd overheard, I couldn't really say much, so I didn't. He frowned. Why? Did you get some new information? No, I just think that night might have broken him, Izuku didn't say. Instead, he said, the public still wants to know what happened, and I've heard nothing from my hero sources. I was just curious. I'll let you know if I hear anything more from my end, Matsukawa told Izuku. Thanks, Izuku said gratefully, I owe you one. Matsukawa chuckled. You owe me more than one, kid. Fair, though Izuku really hated it when people called him that. It wasn't his fault he had a baby face. I'll get you a lunch sometime, he promised. Would rather have drinks, Matsuwa sighed, then winked at Izuku. Probably best not to drink when I'm on the job, though. Izuku nodded. I think I'll stick to lunch. Matsukawa rose to his feet, waving a hand dismissively. Whatever, just buy me a nice bottle for my retirement. His eyes sharpened as he glanced down at Izuku, and good luck. Ground Zero's a puzzle, but if anyone can solve him it's you and your obsessively meticulous note-taking skills. He nodded pointedly to the book in Izuku's hands where he'd been frantically scribbling down the relevant details from Matsukawa's story. Izuku flushed. Thanks, I think. Let me know if you need anything else, Matsukawa called over his shoulder, heading back down the hall. Izuku watched him go for a moment before spinning back around to face his computer. It didn't sound right. Bakugo? Cowering under a blanket? The thought seemed ridiculous, but Izuku considered how the hero had lost it over a mere vending machine, how exhausted and raw and beaten he'd looked. If no one else was going to talk to Bakugo about the incident, he would have to be the one to do it. The only question was how to earn Bakugo's trust, and convince the abrasive hero that he could talk freely. It wasn't for an article, Midoriya didn't think. It was more of a personal project because as much as Ground Zero was in but he had never really frightened Midoriya until that vending machine thing. Something was very wrong with Bakugo, and if none of his friends could figure out how to fix it, well, Izuku was great at interfering in things that were none of his business. Izuku smirked, picking up his phone. Bakugo wouldn't stand a chance. Bakugo wasn't looking for trouble when he was out, which was a change from how he usually operated on patrol. But he had other things on his mind and frankly a villain attack would just be an annoyance. Earlier that morning, he'd ignored a plate of eggs and toast obviously prepared for him by Kirishima. Though just before he'd walked out the door, he'd remembered the green nerd scolding him for wasting food, and he'd actually taken the time to eat the DM and eggs and jogged out of the house with the toast dangling from his mouth. He scowled, trying to figure out how the weirdo had managed to make such an impression on him that he was getting Katsuki to do stuff he didn't want to do when the green nerd wasn't even there to see him do it. Katsuki was probably just feeling sentimental. Or trying to keep Kirishima off his back. Yeah, sure, that sounded safe enough. He could accept that answer. His phone buzzed, and he glanced around before ducking into a nearby alley. According to his contract, he was good to check his personal phone occasionally, so long as he didn't waste too much time on it, and the public didn't catch him on his phone. He glanced at the phone and smirked to himself. Speak of the devil. Coffee nerd, hey. Bakugo stared at the message for a few seconds. What the F does he want? He wondered aloud, eyeing the message as if he could somehow deduce the intent behind the message. As if in answer to his question, a second message appeared. Coffee nerd, do you want to get lunch tomorrow? My treat. Bakugo glared suspiciously his phone, a scowl creeping across his face. He didn't trust people who sent multiple texts before waiting for a reply. That was some Kirishima bullshit. Of course, the stupid spinach-haired nerd would do it too. Grumbling to himself, Katsuki typed back a half-butted reply. He couldn't for the life of him imagine why the green nerd would want to spend more time with him, especially after he'd made it abundantly clear that Katsuki's personality made him nervous or whatever. But he had to admit, he wouldn't mind seeing the guy again. He was feisty and clever, and despite being quirkless, Katsuki was tempted to describe him as badass. Bakugo could respect him, even if the green nerd did have a mothering instinct to rival Kirishima. Coffee nerd, don't hate me for this, but I feel like you could use someone in your corner. Coffee nerd, also you're an a-hole, but an interesting a-hole, and I can appreciate that. Okay, first of all, this guy, Katsuki didn't need anyone, he was fine. Also, this guy walking around slinging insults like Katsuki would just sit back and take something like that. Besides, Katsuki definitely didn't consider this guy an interesting a-hole. He was more like a book report about toe fungus. Boring and stinky. Scowling, Katsuki tapped out another bullshit response, mostly because this nerd. Me. Coffee nerd. God, your vocabulary is so rich and varied. Coffee nerd. So is that a yes or a no? Damn it, Katsuki wanted to tell him off, but the sarcasm was just so snappy. No one else had talked to him like that since the incident. They'd all been handling him with kid gloves, afraid to even look at him sideways. He missed people straight up calling him an a-hole, though the half-and-half BSer didn't count. Katsuki could tell he meant it in a way the coffee nerd didn't. He sighed, considering his options. Was he really that desperate for people who would just straight up call him an a-hole to his face and believe that his insults and threats were empty? He was. Katsuki sighed, composing a slightly more detailed response. Slightly. Me, fine. What time? Coffee nerd took a bit longer to answer, and Bakugo caught himself smirking. He hadn't expected Katsuki to say yes, again. That ought to show him he shouldn't ask Katsuki for something just because he expected a no. Coffee nerd, are you close to Haruyuku? Did the idiot not remember that he was Ground Zero? All he had to do was look up his hero agency and he'd know exactly where he was operating. Some nerd couldn't even take the time to do his DMN research. And this guy had gone to UA? What a disappointment. Still, he owed the green guy a response. He was close enough to Haruyuku that it wouldn't be an issue. Except for the stupid trains. Coffee nerd, do you like pancakes? Katsuki grimaced. Hell no. But he felt that the nerd probably deserved something of an explanation, rather than another string of expletives. See, Kirishima, he did know how to communicate, sort of. Me, can't stand sweets. Coffee nerd, they have a spicy pork and kimchi pancake. That sounded fake, but okay, he was just going to roll with it because while a savory pancake sounded disgusting, if the nerd was picking where they went it meant one less thing for him to deal with. With a sigh, Katsuki acquiesced. Coffee nerd, cool. See you at Haruyuku Station, tomorrow at 1? He'll be there. Katsuki gazed down at the messages for another moment, considering. A spicy pork and kimchi pancake still sounded disgusting, but he looked forward to saying as much when he tried it tomorrow. Plus, since Half and Half was back in the office, Katsuki was getting his day off. He could sleep in and meet the green nerd for lunch after sleeping in. Maybe he'd even have enough sleep to not be a total a-hole to the green guy. He huffed a little to himself at that, amused. It hadn't worked for him yet, but there was a first time for everything, he supposed. He pointedly did not think about how Shudo had asked him about whether getting coffee with shitty green hair had been a date. It hadn't been a date, and neither was this. It was just nice to find a guy who wasn't treating him like he was fragile or broken. Shoving his phone back in a pouch on his belt, Bakugo headed back out on patrol, pretending not to have seen the nerd's reply. Coffee nerd, great. See you then. Izuku stared at his phone in shock. It couldn't really be that easy to arrange a lunch with Ground Zero, right? The pro hero must be FNG with him. This was Ground Zero, the hero who never had time for anything or anyone. He wasn't even talking to friends. Why the hell was he making time for Izuku? Maybe he still felt bad about the vending machine, Izuku thought. Well, good. He should feel bad. He'd had a minor breakdown and slammed Izuku into a wall. With a scowl, Izuku dialed the number for the pancake restaurant in Haruyuku, waiting for a greeting before speaking up. Hi, I'd like to make a reservation for tomorrow, he said, listening for a moment. 2, he answered, and then, 1 o'clock. He nodded a little, saying, Midoriya, bowing a little before thanking the person on the other end and apologizing for the inconvenience. The person on the other end assured him it was no trouble, and Izuku hung up, feeling nervous. He hoped that Ground Zero, Bakugo, wouldn't mind the restaurant too much. He scowled, asking himself why he cared what the pro hero thought. Because, he mused, this was too good an opportunity to pass up. What if he could get more details from him about that night? Every media outlet in the city was looking to get their hands on this information, and while this was still filed under a personal project in Izuku's mind, he wouldn't have much of a problem taking it from personal to work, especially if he learned something interesting. The only problem was figuring out how to verify what he might learn from credible sources, since everyone knew Ground Zero hated to be on the record with anything other than expletive-laden rants. Well, there was always Matsukawa and his police contacts. Izuku had less experience working the crime beat, as he generally focused on heroes and villain attacks, but in this case it might do him some good to make some connections in the police department. He jotted down a quick note of that, and then glanced absently at his laptop, only to freeze. A villain attack? How had he missed it? He quickly zoomed on his screen, and was relieved to see it had just been reported. It was nearby, too. If he was lucky, he might actually be able to watch some of the conflict, not just get there for the aftermath. Tossing his notes and laptop in his bag, Izuku absently remembered he hadn't eaten dinner yet and snagged a Soy Joy meal bar from his desk, promising himself a real dinner later. Shoving the Soy Joy in his bag, Izuku scrambled out of his cubicle and rushed down the hall, nearly careening into two of his coworkers. Sorry. I got a story, he yelped on his way by, though honestly it might not be print-worthy. He hoped it would be good enough to get him at least a small article. He took the stairs 2 at a time, sprinting through the parking garage. The trains would be down, so he needed to take one of the company vehicles if he was going to get close. He saw one of their photographers, also making a beeline for a vehicle. Best jeanist. Atsuma Satsuzu shouted over his shoulder, catching sight of Izuku as he yanked open the door to one of their smaller vans. Yeah. You too. Izuku gasped out, skidding to a stop next to him. You know it, Atsuma answered with a quick grin, straight white teeth contrasting with his tanned features and dark unkempt hair. He fingered his camera bag, slung haphazardly over one shoulder. Need a lift? Izuku swallowed nervously. Sure, he agreed, even though his stomach clenched a little at the thought. The last time he'd ridden with Atsuma, he'd felt lucky to escape with his life. The young man's quirk was termed perfect angle, but it functioned in such a way that when activated, the man could watch things unfold as if in slow motion. It meant he always managed to capture just the right shot for photography. Unfortunately, it also meant that in the car, the man knew the exact moment to turn the car, and he would not waste a single second on things like brakes, red lights, or even stop signs, unless the angles didn't add up. Izuku was convinced the man should have a traffic record in every prefecture, they just hadn't caught him yet. Probably because he knew the exact angles to avoid detection by traffic cameras and patrol cars alike. Abject terror aside, if anyone was going to get him to the scene of the villain attack in record time, it would be Atsuma. He scrambled to the passenger side of the van, buckling up and saying a quick prayer that they would survive the drive as Atsuma slid behind the wheel, revving the engine. Did you hear which villain it was? Atsuma asked Midoriya as he peeled out, leaving what seemed like half the tire tread back on the cement of the parking garage as he careened out of the narrow entrance. Midoriya was clinging to his bag, trying not to let his fear show on his face. No, he answered, hoping he didn't accidentally bite through his tongue as the van bounced over several speed bumps. Atsuma paid no mind to the van's shocks, complaining at the abuse, happy to drive under the delusion that 80 kilometers per hour was a rational speed to drive through a neighborhood. Let me check the updates, Izuku said, digging carefully into his bag as the van screeched wildly around a corner, leaving more of the tires on the road behind them. He hoped there was still some traction to be had from the poor treads on this van, but he wasn't holding out much hope. He scanned the details quickly. Looks like they called in backup, he noted. Red Riot's there too, and so is Lemillion? Really? He stared at the ever-growing list of heroes apparently being called up to fight, beginning to think that if the drive didn't kill him, whatever disaster had drawn in so many top heroes just might. You're shitting me, I haven't had the chance to shoot Lemillion in months. Atsuma exclaimed, turning to look at Midoriya instead of watching the road. Izuku tried not to look petrified, as he had learned on previous rides that this sort of behavior seemed to do more harm than good, often encouraging Atsuma to take more risks. Instead, Izuku quickly turned his gaze back to the device, hoping his shift in attention might encourage Atsuma to shift his attention back to the road. Oh man, he gasped. Whoever the villain was, they set off a huge explosion in the area. It looks like a couple of buildings are beginning to lose structural integrity. Amen. Atsuma exclaimed, Guess that means we'll have to park a few extra blocks away. The boss told me if I totaled one more of these vans he would take it out of my paycheck, and I don't have a great paycheck. His dark eyes turned back to Midoriya as he smiled ruefully. Hope you brought your running shoes. Izuku nodded seriously, internally begging Atsuma to look at the road. His quirk only worked if he actively watched where he was going, and while Atsuma may have had confidence in his abilities, Izuku knew that there was a very fine line between confidence and overconfidence, and he did not wish to be reminded of the difference between the two. Atsuma's gaze returned to the road ahead as he swung the van around two corners that Izuku didn't even realize the van had a turning radius to accommodate, and stomped on the brakes, bringing the van to a screeching halt. Atsuma threw the van in park, pulled the emergency brake, and glanced at Izuku. Good luck, Midoriya. Hope we both get what we're looking for with this. He grinned and hopped out of the van, jogging down the street as he pulled his camera out of his bag. Izuku watched him go for a moment, trying to catch his breath. He'd survived another ride with Atsuma, but at what cost? His legs felt like jelly. As he shakily extricated himself from the van, he could already hear the groans and deep shuddering crackles of buildings struggling to stay upright in the near distance, and the shouts of heroes working to evacuate the area. Despite Atsuma's comment, they seemed to have parked pretty close to the action. Still, if Midoriya wanted a good story, he'd need to get a whole lot closer than this. He'd also need to stay out of sight if he wanted to be there for any length of time. It was a good thing he was pretty short and nondescript. It gave him a distinct advantage when he was headed into disaster areas. Even if they evacuated him once, he could sometimes manage to sneak back in from a different point. His standing record was 4 evacuations from one conflict site. He'd only been caught sneaking back in a few times, but whenever he did get caught, his baby face made him look very innocent and confused, and Midoriya had no problem using it to his advantage if it kept him closer to the action, or at least out of trouble. A rumble shook the ground beneath Izuku's feet as he shut the door to the van. Slinging his own bag over his shoulder and digging out his notepad and a pen, Izuku began jogging towards the disaster site. This was definitely an article-worthy event. He just hoped he would be able to get close enough to the action to acquire exclusive information. Ground Zero had been minding his own DMN business when he felt the ground rumble, and he knew the sensation immediately and intimately. Somewhere nearby, someone had set off an explosion. He was running towards it as he called it in, unsure if he was the nearest hero or not. The response he got was both satisfying and unnerving, because his agency had been trying to keep him out of the public eye ever since his incident. And yet, when he called in the explosion, he was told to immediately go and assess the situation. So naturally, he fired up his quirk and took to the rooftops for a better view, and what he saw made his heart leap into his throat. Several large buildings were streaming smoke and listing dangerously. There were people screaming, barely audible over the ominous creaking of support structures well on their way towards buckling under the strain of keeping the unbalanced concrete behemoths upright. Bakugo knew explosions, and he knew how to assess damage done by explosions. It came with the territory when your body produced nitroglycerin. He could tell, within seconds, that those buildings didn't have much time, and it was imperative that any responding heroes focus on getting the civilians out. He reported as much to his agency when he finally managed to get a word in edgewise. He could hear the calls for backup going out, calling up other agencies even. And he pushed himself as much as he dared, barreling into the nearest structure and heading for the blast site. He knew how rubble and debris worked. He'd get people out if he could and leave stabilization and upper floor evacuations to heroes more suited to the task. He knew explosions more intimately than nearly any other hero on active duty, and he was going to put that knowledge to good use. Except, he'd forgotten, in all the excitement, with sheer adrenaline coursing through his veins, that he'd had a streak of bad press. He was unpleasantly reminded of his current standing in the public eye when he approached the first victim, and they actually flinched, screaming, "Get away from me," and trying to claw their way deeper into the pile of rubble they were pinned beneath. Scowling, Katsuki dug at the collapsed portion of the wall, ignoring the way the accident victim was now hurling insults at him, and implying that he'd been the one to blow up the FING building? What the F was wrong with this guy? Katsuki kept working, if only because it was his job and it would serve the BSRD right to owe him one after all was said and done, so he dug the young man out. "Can you stand?" Katsuki demanded brusquely. The man clambered to his feet with a wince, taking a few steps. "Fine. No thanks to you." "All right, that was some FING bullshit." Katsuki had just used his quirk to reduce the rubble trapping him to dust without destabilizing the structure, and that was his FING response? Oh. He ignored the comment anyway, because there wasn't any DM time to set the man straight. He pointed in the direction he'd come from. "Exits that way," he barked, and the man jumped a little at his harsh tone. "That's right, a-hole. Not so tough now that you remember I could blow your arms off if I wanted to," Bakugo thought viciously. That was all he had time for, before making his way deeper into the wreckage, pulling out a support device his agency provided to each hero. It detected heat signatures, so he could search for bodies buried under rubble. Except, as he looked closer to the heart of the explosion, he realized it was still pretty warm in there, making it harder to distinguish what was and wasn't human. Well, there were still a few victims between him and that point. Hopefully it would be clearer to his device after a couple of easier-to-identify rescues. He hurried to the next trapped individual, only for them to cover their head and cry out. Bakugo tensed and looked up, expecting to see the ceiling crumbling in on them. Nothing. Did these shitheads even want to be rescued? Shaking his head, Ground Zero doggedly went after the debris until the woman was freed. Her right leg was badly mangled and bleeding profusely. Digging into a pouch on his belt, Ground Zero knelt by her leg to explain, gruffly, "You're bleeding too much, I'm going to tourniquet this." Hopefully she'd get treatment before too much damage was done to her leg from cutting off the blood flow, but as his first aid training had drilled into him, better to lose a limb than your life. She kicked and screamed as he approached, something about, "Don't burn me," and while cauterizing a wound was another way to stop the bleeding, Ground Zero had the feeling this was not what she feared. Why did people have to SCK so much? He'd already told her exactly what he was going to do, and ignoring her feeble shoves, which did little more than validate his concern that the blood loss was a serious problem, he quickly wrapped the tourniquet around her leg and pulled it tight, tying it off quickly before picking her up and jogging to the exit, passing the first a-hole on his way out. "What part of Get Out did you fail to understand?" Ground Zero barked as he passed the man, who tensed up at the sound of his voice before speeding up a bit, following Ground Zero up the stairs and outside. A temporary triage was already up and running a safe distance away from the blast zone, so Ground Zero pushed himself a bit more, breaking into a run. The injured woman clutched to his chest. He dropped her in the arms of the first available paramedic he could find, and headed right back in, passing the a-hole who was only just managing to dazedly stumble out of the structure. Ground Zero managed to clear the lower floor despite his conscious victim's best efforts to run away from him, fortunate that most of the people seemed to have been merely trapped by the debris, not caught up in the explosion itself. He'd run to and from triage probably 10 times at this point when a call came in on his radio, calling him off the rescue team and into active combat. Again, not a great sign, considering his agency wanted him out of the spotlight. If they wanted him out there fighting villains, it was because they needed someone who could hit hard and fast, and they needed it bad enough to not give a DMN about public appearances. Katsuki blasted his way out towards the fight, tuning into his radio, trying to figure out what was going on. Best he could figure, they were up against several villains, one of whom boasted an explosion quirk, which, Katsuki had enough bad press of his own to deal with. How dare this villain call his quirk into question too? The explosion quirk this guy had involved some sort of timer-activated system, though, which immediately had Ground Zero wondering what sort of quirk that would be. He didn't have time to wonder long, bursting headlong into the fray, only to draw up short, staring at a grenade-themed villain. He had a dark tank top, baggy pants, knee pads and steel-toed boots, grenade gauntlets on his arms, sheet. No wonder the victims had accused him of setting off the explosion. This villain was a FANG wannabe. No wonder his agency had called him out. They couldn't have the media confusing this guy for the real Ground Zero. What the actual a-hole? Ground Zero demanded, pushing his way through a few heroes fighting their own skirmishes to confront the guy with obviously bleached hair. "Are those contacts?" he asked, staring at the man's crimson eyes with something hovering between disgust and chagrin. Ground Zero. The villain drew himself up to his full height, about 3 inches shorter than Bakugo, his shoulders nowhere near as broad. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror. "Do you know why I dash?" "I don't FNG care," Ground Zero cut him off. "You going to come in peacefully?" The villain's eyes widened as he blinked disbelievingly at the pro hero. "Why would you do that?" Ground Zero fought to keep from grinding his teeth in frustration, without success. "You blew up 3 FING buildings full of innocent people," he pointed out. "That's not true," the man protested, sounding insulted. For a moment, Ground Zero felt hopeful. Maybe the man wasn't really a killer, just a weird, obsessed cosplayer in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe. "These are the headquarters of Shine Media, the news agency that's been sullying your name," the villain continued, and Ground Zero felt his stomach clench. "Wait," he said slowly, wishing he didn't have to ask the question. "You did this for me?" The villain smiled, and his face shone with the intense light of a wicked man who believes himself a martyr. "Of course." Ground Zero swore he would bring this FING a-hole to justice, even if he had to drag him in by his bleached blonde spikes to do so. Izuku managed to stumble across triage on his way into the conflict zone, so he took a moment to listen in on a few conversations between the victims and the first responders. What he heard made his blood run cold. There were dozens of victims, completely convinced that Ground Zero had been the one to attempt to topple the buildings. Eyewitnesses were saying that the hero had run into their building, raving about how Shine Media had ruined his good name, and then explosions had ripped across the complex. But wait. Ground Zero's quirk was building up nitroglycerin from his sweat and releasing it in a focused burst. Yes, it was possible for him to remove a gauntlet and have an ally detonate it remotely, but to cause that much damage to all 3 buildings simultaneously? Forgetting entirely that Ground Zero wasn't a FING terrorist, just an a-hole who shook people down for coffee, the timeline of events didn't make sense, and who the hell would Ground Zero have gotten to help him blow up the buildings? His only friends were other pro-heroes. It didn't make sense narratively, not to mention Shine Media Group was hardly the only news organization to go after the pro-hero. Pretty much every station was still perseverating about whether or not Ground Zero was going dark, and this incident would only serve to make matters worse. No, something weird was going on, Izuku decided, moving on from triage and deeper into the conflict zone. The witness's comments made a lot more sense as soon as he managed to get closer to the action, spotting Atsuma just across the way, snapping photos this way and that. There were several villains present, a few of whom Izuku barely recognized, and he prided himself on his knowledge of everything pro-hero related, even villains. As Midoriya settled back and pulled out his notebook to begin noting down what he noticed of the various events, he spotted Ground Zero out of the corner of his eye. Well, why would he be here? It would make more sense to have him on rescue, less visible, out of sight, out of mind, less bad press for the now notorious hero. As he watched the fight unfold, it didn't take long for Izuku to realize something wasn't right. He narrowed his eyes, realizing with some surprise that it wasn't Ground Zero, after all. Whoever it was may have looked like Ground Zero, at least from a distance, but he carried himself all wrong. He wasn't throwing his weight around like he was better than everyone, like the type of person who expected people to drop everything just to buy them a DMN drink from a vending machine. Izuku felt a small part of him note that he should probably try and get over the whole vending machine thing, but, damn it, he was still set off about it, and he intended to stay that way for a while yet, even if it did make him sound petty. As if that weren't evidence enough, a moment later, Izuku heard a loud crack-a-boom, and then the real Ground Zero was sailing into the fray, propelled through the air by his impressive nitroglycerin quirk. He drew up short, also spotting the imposter, and strode towards him with what appeared to be single-minded intent. Yeah, Midoriya noted absently, this guy was the real deal. No one else could manage to look like a complete D by simply walking. Ground Zero exchanged pleasantries with the villain, or maybe the villain launched into a monologue, It was really anyone's guess, and Ground Zero never did interviews, so unless the villain felt like talking about the details of their exchange, it would probably remain a mystery. Ground Zero tensed like a coiled snake, about to strike, when something made him change his mind, and he lifted his arms slowly into the air like he was surrendering. His next words were faint, due to the distance between where Izuku was and where the actual fight was going down, but loud enough that he could not only make out the words, but the pro-hero's clipped, anxious tone. "He's got the roof wired." Ground Zero half-shouted. At this, the fight below seemed to shift its energy, as any hero still fighting obviously transitioned from damage control to immediate takedown. Several villains went down hard, broken bones and dislocated joints popping up in almost every fight. Before Izuku had time to realize that the fight had shifted dramatically in the hero's favor, the other villains were completely neutralized. Because they'd been authorized to use extreme force, Izuku finally realized, seeing the devastating injuries some of the villains now sported. Heroes rarely did more than minor damage, unless they were given permission to use extreme force, often for emergency situations only. Apparently when Ground Zero sounded worried, that was enough for agencies to give the go-ahead for extreme force. Interesting. Izuku watched as the heroes, now able to make a quick sweep of the roof, left a few of their number to keep an eye on the battered villains while the rest fanned out across the roof. Meanwhile, Ground Zero's eyes hadn't left the imposter, his fingers twitching like he wanted to blow the false hero right off the aforementioned roof, but something was holding him back. Midoriya frowned, eyeing the imposter, and wondering what it was the man held in his hand. A detonator? The explosions hadn't been quirk-related at all. Scanning the roof, Izuku caught sight of a small, gray bundle with wires sticking out of it, being examined but not touched by Shudo, who was speaking, presumably to someone on his earpiece. He was nodding as if listening to instructions, and suddenly Izuku realized that his vantage point was definitely within the blast radius, and no one knew he was there. Well, if the thing blew, at least he'd go out in a blaze of glory, Midoriya decided. Ground Zero appeared to be talking to the imposter again, his face taking on the same bland, shuttered look he'd given Izuku the night of the vending machine, when he tried to pretend he wasn't seconds away from losing his sheet. Really, Midoriya decided, he had enough for a story either way, and Shudo was always an easy interview. He could probably pull him aside after the explosive was defused, and, quick as a snake, Ground Zero's hand shot out, batting the detonator into the air before his other hand caught it, a small explosion in his palm destroying it beyond repair. As the villain stared at the melted plastic with a mixture of shock and disbelief, Ground Zero launched himself at the villain, grabbing his hands and locking his arms tightly in cuffs behind his back. His eyes were hard as he marched the villain across the roof to where Shudo appeared to be waiting. The two exchanged some terse words, and then Ground Zero was off again. Midoriya wasn't sure what surprised him more, that Ground Zero wasn't sticking around to bring the guy in himself, or that Ground Zero had managed to lull the villain into a false sense of security. Izuku never would have pegged Ground Zero as a skilled negotiator, but several heroes ped their heads in that way they did when someone was talking on the radio. A few of them scattered, while the remaining heroes were rounding up the rest of the villains to take them down to waiting police transport. Izuku noted that Shudo was taking great care to ensure the imposter's hands weren't able to touch anything, which had Izuku wondering if that was maybe related to the man's quirk. In any case, things appeared to be winding down, so Izuku started the long trek back down this building's fire escape. It creaked at him ominously, which Izuku wasn't happy about, but, well, if he'd wanted to be in a safe journalism field, he shouldn't have chosen to specialize in pro-hero activities. As far as Izuku was concerned, risking your life for the best possible story came with the territory. Between Utsuma's photos and his prior knowledge giving him a better idea of what to ask for in interviews, Izuku was beginning to suspect he might have even stumbled onto some front-page material. He continued scrambling down the ladder, and in his excitement over the story, he wasn't being quite as cautious as he should have been. After all, this building had been damaged by the explosions too. What Izuku didn't realize was that the fire escape itself had also been damaged. He figured it out pretty quickly when the bottom half of the fire escape unexpectedly broke away from the wall, leaving Izuku clinging to it frantically, still nearly 5 stories up. He saw several other figures clinging to the same fire escape further down. This building hadn't actually had a bomb go off in it, so they had been evacuating it without hero assistance. But why were there other people on the fire escape? Izuku clung to the edge of the ladder, trying not to feel terrified at the way it swayed as he shimmied down to the nearest person. "Hey!" he called, and the person looked up at Izuku. "What's going on?" "All I know is we had to take this thing." The man was shaking like a leaf. "The elevators and staircases are crawling with the bomb squad. One of the villains apparently planted other explosives all around this area." Izuku blinked. "So we don't have to use the fire escape?" The man shook his head vigorously. "No, but I don't like to walk past bombs, and they shut down the elevators." "So you'd rather dangle from a damaged fire escape?" Izuku thought incredulously. He glanced at a nearby window, but it appeared to be locked and the fire escape was swinging in the breeze, so getting into the building would be hard. He glanced up anxiously, seeing another section of the escape pulling away from the wall. He really needed to get out of this. "Keep moving down," he told the guy, who was between him and the rest of the escape. He wasn't sure how much longer the structure would hold, and he had no intention of still being on the 5th floor when it finally went down. The man was shaking like a leaf, clinging to the railing with both arms wrapped around it like he was embracing it. "I can't," he exclaimed, tightening his chokehold on the railing. Izuku eyed the edge of the escape, where it had pulled away from the wall. The escape was listing so far away it was nearly a 3-foot gap, a gap that grew wider the further down the ladder you went. He didn't think that bracing against the wall would be a wise move, but he had to get around this guy somehow. With a sigh, he gripped the handrail just above where the guy who couldn't move was clinging to it, and started easing past him, feet barely able to fit halfway on the steps with a man crouched between him and the railing. Suddenly, the fire escape dropped down about 3 feet and jerked further away from the wall. Izuku's grip faltered for just a second, but that second was all it took. The next moment, a startled yelp escaped his mouth and he was falling, hands stretching out to catch something, anything, but the fire escape was swinging away from the building, away from him, and there was nothing along the smooth cement surface of the building for him to hold onto. He could probably survive the fall, but it would hurt, and he thought wildly he wouldn't recover in time to write his front page article, damn it. The ground was rushing up to meet him when he heard a faint crash, and then a resounding boom, and suddenly he wasn't falling down but sideways. Strong arms wrapped around him, and he was sailing through the air. He was manhandled into a makeshift sort of over-the-shoulder carry, and he smelled smoke, dust, and a cloyingly sweet, not quite sweaty smell. One arm held him tightly slung over a broad shoulder, the other stretched out towards the ground, and crack-a-boom, "Oh sheet, that sounded so much louder when it went off right next to you," and "Hey roundface, coming in hot." Ground Zero bellowed, and Izuku stared in shock as Uravity glanced up, and then jumped, higher than should have been possible, except she had an anti-gravity quirk. Izuku felt himself being shifted, and then Ground Zero mumbling, "Hope you don't have issues with vertigo," before high-fiving the gravity-manipulating heroine as they neared the ground. Izuku felt weird, and Ground Zero adjusted again, a few small crackles from his quirk enough to steer them to the ground, at which point Uravity tapped the fellow pro-hero's shoulder, and gravity took hold of them once more. "I'll get the fire escape," she told Ground Zero, who still had Izuku slung over one shoulder. "The guy at the top refuses to move. I fell trying to get around him," Izuku called after her as she jogged off. She called, "Thanks," over her shoulder, but didn't seem to recognize him in all the fuss. Another point towards having such nondescript features. Considering how many times he'd interviewed her, they knew each other fairly well and he'd been half expecting her to scold him for not being more careful. Then again, she had much bigger fish to fry, and may have decided to chew him out later. He wouldn't put it past her. Ground Zero pulled Izuku off of his shoulder, setting him on the ground. "You hurt?" he demanded gruffly, giving Izuku a once-over before taking a half-step back, his eyes widening. "You!" he exclaimed. Sheet, of course Ground Zero would be the one to recognize him, and not the hero he'd literally been interviewing since he'd first started writing for the school newspaper. Sorry, I really wasn't expecting to see you before pancakes, or I would have just invited you in person, Izuku quipped, running his mouth because that's what happened when he got nervous. Ground Zero gaped at Izuku. You almost effing died and you're worried about that? He snapped. Are you injured, nerd? Worried. Izuku considered his body. He was shaking but otherwise. Just shaken, Izuku decided. He must have looked worse than he felt, though, because Ground Zero pointed towards the first responders. You should have them look you over, just in case, he told Izuku. When Izuku didn't immediately follow his instructions, he scowled and made a shooing motion with his hands. Izuku turned to do as he was asked, and his knees buckled. Odin, he thought faintly, maybe something is wrong after all. Katsuki surged forward, catching the green nerd before he could hit the pavement. His eyes were rolling back in his head like he wanted to pass out, but he was still clinging to consciousness. Midoriya seemed to fight for a minute before his gaze steadied, and he was able to put some weight back on his own feet. I thought I wasn't injured, Midoriya commented blithely, glancing at Katsuki with a hint of concern, but maybe. It's just shock, Ground Zero assured him, tugging Midoriya's arm over his shoulder for some support, running his other arm around the nerd's waist to keep him from wobbling too much. He started off at a slow pace, walking him to the paramedics. They'll give you a blanket and maybe make you put your feet up. You'll be fine in an hour or two, probably. Okay, Midoriya said weakly, glancing at Bakugo and treating him to a hesitant smile. Bakugo could feel him trembling against his side as they continued to amble away from the evacuation zone. Thanks. Katsuki merely grunted in acknowledgement, but he ever so slightly tightened his grip on the green nerd's waist. He walked Midoriya over to where some volunteers were handing out blankets and little juice boxes. He spotted the paramedic overseeing them and tugged Midoriya over to him. Doesn't seem injured, he explained the situation to the paramedic as quickly as possible, just shaken up from what could have been a nasty fall. The paramedic nodded, handing Midoriya a blanket. Katsuki awkwardly patted Broccoli Head on the shoulder, offering a quick, "Don't go falling off any more fire escapes now." Midoriya shot him a disgruntled look. It wasn't exactly on my to-do list, he groused. Seeing a bit of fire return to Midoriya's gaze made Katsuki feel a hell of a lot better about the whole situation. Even when traumatized, it seemed Midoriya couldn't resist the allure of making a smart remark. Katsuki sneered down at Midoriya, who was already hunched under a blanket. Whatever you say, just stay out of trouble, I-hole. I'll try, Midoriya agreed, but his eyes flashed. Don't get exploded, bombed, or whatever. You be safe too. Ha! Katsuki smirked, trying not to let his surprise show in his face. When was the last time someone really worried about me? He wondered and couldn't think of a time. Well, besides Rocks for Brains and his DMN intervention, but that was just because Kirishima couldn't resist meddling. So, having a quirkless nobody worrying about him should have been annoying, possibly demeaning, but somehow, it didn't bother him. That aside, you don't have to worry about me, Katsuki informed Midoriya. Haughtily, putting myself in dangerous situations is what I'm paid to do. It's my job. It's my life, he didn't say, though it would have been equally true. With that, he spun on his heel and headed back towards the groaning buildings to help with the last of the evacuation. True to his word, Ground Zero did his job, but in all honesty he was just going through the motions when he probably should have been more careful, considering how dangerous the area was. But he was preoccupied, his mind whirling as he worked. Was Midoriya's workplace in that building? What if it had been the one caught in one of the initial explosions? What if Katsuki hadn't gotten to his misguided fan and taken out the detonator in time? What if the imposter had gotten his hands on more C4, or had been trained to demolish structures, rather than scattering plastic explosives around the structures willy-nilly? What if Ground Zero hadn't been here to stop the man who'd plagiarized his whole look? What? He froze, a sudden realization hitting him like a freight train. What if everyone had thought that Ground Zero actually was the real culprit? Now Katsuki was freaking himself out. How many witnesses were out there telling the media that they'd seen Ground Zero? Or hell, even a Ground Zero impersonator was incriminating enough, ranting about injustice and blowing up buildings. His name had already been dragged through the mud once. Why the hell had this villain fixated on him? What if the villain's actions had killed Midoriya? It shouldn't have hit him so hard. The green nerd was just a quirkless a-hole who wasn't scared of anything, but he was so fragile. Katsuki hadn't even recognized him at first. He just spotted a falling civilian and had shouted to Uravity before realizing she wasn't going to get to him in time. What if he'd hesitated just a moment longer? Would Midoriya even be alive right now? Hero work was supposed to be easy. Explode villains, save lives, and win. Why was it that the longer he worked in the business, the more he felt that his victories were hollow, useless? What was the point in defeating a villain if he still couldn't save everyone he wanted to save? By the time the area had been declared fully evacuated and he'd finished talking with the cops, Bakugo was tired. Not just physically, but mentally. He'd always thought about heroes as people who won their fights, no matter what. However, it was beginning to seem like pro-hero work wasn't a matter of winning so much as simply not losing, and he wasn't sure how he felt about that, or if he even wanted to feel anything at all, ever again. He was just tired. Tired. Izuku was exhausted by the time he finished up his article. He'd gotten exclusive interviews with Shudo and Uravity, who blessedly hadn't recognized him after all. Plus he'd managed to talk with a few civilian witnesses and a vaguely helpful police detective that Matsukawa had introduced to him upon Izuku's request. Fortunately, both Shudo and Uravity had verified for him that the bomber had been a Ground Zero impersonator, though neither had felt comfortable making a guess as to the motivation behind such a disguise. That was fine. Izuku could leave the theorizing up to the readers. He preferred sticking to the facts. Atsuma had gotten some great photos of the heroes, as usual, and just before he'd left the office, Izuku had heard that his story would be not just front page, it would run under the headline, "Terrorists Dressed as Ground Zero Bombs Shine Media Headquarters." He was so giddy with excitement that, on a normal night, he might have had trouble sleeping. On a normal night. But now that he was finally home, he felt utterly spent. Besides, he had to meet Ground Zero at Harajuku Station in just over 6 hours, and one of those hours was going to be spent on the train from his place back into Tokyo. With a groan, Midoriya collapsed into bed, only to hear his phone vibrate. He scowled, fumbling for his phone and eyeing the message blearily. "King Explodo Kill, you okay after today?" Izuku considered the text blankly. Why the hell was Ground Zero texting him at but 1:00 in the morning? Did the man never sleep? "Me? Why are you up?" "King Explodo Kill, just got back from debrief." Oudman. Izuku hadn't realized it would take the pro-heroes just as long to wrap everything up as it took him to write an entire article. He immediately forgave Bakugo for the text. He couldn't abide an early riser at this particular moment, but it sounded instead like Ground Zero was checking in on him as soon as he had a spare moment. It was almost sweet. "Me? Seriously? That's so late, it's already morning." "King Explodo Kill, at least trains are running now. If debrief drags past 1 you are stuck at the office till first train at 5 anyway." Izuku winced. That sounded frankly terrible. "Me? Do you just sleep in your office when that happens?" "King Explodo Kill, not enough cots so usually we arm wrestle and Red Riot always wins." As tired as Izuku was, the mental image of an exhausted and beleaguered Ground Zero slowly but surely losing an arm wrestling match to an equally exhausted-looking Red Riot was enough to make him chuckle aloud. "Me? Sounds terrible. King Explodo Kill, you get used to it." Izuku sniggered a little as he replied. "Me? Get used to which one? The sleep deprivation or losing to Red Riot?" For a long moment, there was no reply. "King Explodo Kill." Izuku was about to send an apology for being out of line when another text joined the first. "King Explodo Kill." Izuku grinned a little to himself as he settled back on his bed. "Me? If you need to sleep more, we could get dinner instead." "King Explodo Kill, I just fucking told you I'm used to not getting any sleep, it's fine." "King Explodo Kill, but if you need more time we can reschedule." "Me? I'll see you at 1 then." Katsuki stared at his phone like it might bite him at any moment. What the f was he doing? He'd probably woken Midoriya, and all because he had to know that Midoriya had gotten back safely. Hell, this had been the worst 24 hours. Maybe not the worst, there was still that incident with the 2 civilian casualties. With a groan, Katsuki dragged a palm down the front of his face. Like he hadn't already found enough nightmare fuel today, his brain had gone and dredged up even worse shit to feel terrible about. He dragged his feet as he moved from the doorway where he'd been standing and staring at his phone, moving slowly into the kitchen. Even his bones hurt, especially his arms, probably due to the sheer number of targeted explosions he'd used when clearing the rubble during the evacuation. Sinking down on one of the bar stools in the kitchen, Katsuki watched Kirishima putter around the kitchen. His roommate glanced over at him, a question in his gaze, but Katsuki wasn't sure he knew what Kirishima wanted. Not one to beat around the bush, Katsuki eyed Ijuru before demanding an answer. "You want something?" "I don't know, I'm sorry," Kirishima answered weakly, filling the electric kettle and turning it on before turning to face him. "It seems that the villain was, he gestured weakly, deranged enough to think I'd appreciate terrorism being done in my name?" Katsuki grated out ruefully. God, he was tired. What a shitty FING day. Ijuru winced a little. "Yeah, it gets worse, though," he explained, turning to grab something and toss it in front of Bakugo. "Terrorist dressed as Ground Zero bombs Shine Media headquarters," the headline screamed. "Great. That's it?" Katsuki snapped irritably, glowering at the byline with a sneer. Who the f did this Deku guy think he was, anyway? What a self-righteous, pompous a-hole. He probably hadn't even been there, since, at least at a glance, all his quotes seemed to be from post-evacuation interviews. Bakugo had seen a few of his co-workers and former classmates talking to reporters during the post-evac, but by now reporters knew better than to come to him for a decent interview. It just wasn't fair, though, the way the focus always shifted to the havoc wreaked by the villains rather than extolling the good that heroes had done in the face of adversity. Everyone that day had worked so FING hard to clean up the destruction and keep civilians safe. And yet, all the media cared about was the DMN perpetrator. What am I bet that there's barely even a mention of most of the heroes who worked their DMN butts off today, yesterday? Katsuki amended, glancing at the clock. F-7. He could probably get 4 hours of sleep if he went to bed in the next 15 minutes, but now he was getting worked up. Skimming the article with a scowl, he grumbled, "What was this Deku guy even doing while we were out there saving lives? Probably sitting around on his butt writing this bullshit." Ijuru poured the now boiling water into 2 mugs and added a tea bag to each one chrysanthemum, the other ginger. He handed the ginger tea to Katsuki and sipped contemplatively at his own chrysanthemum brew. He did make it clear that the villain was deluded, though, Ijuru pointed out mildly. A lot of articles might have implied you were somehow involved, but this article almost seems to be biased in your favor. Katsuki glowered at the ginger tea for a moment before taking a long drink, enjoying the sharp, almost spicy bite of the herb. "I don't see how," he grumbled. "It was a fucking PR disaster, and more than that Katsuki was gripping the handle of the mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. "People got hurt because this freak's twisted mind made him think I would appreciate it. Like I would enjoy seeing buildings toppled by out-of-control explosions." He sighed heavily. He didn't want to think about it anymore. The villain was locked up and the bombs were deactivated. He was just glad it was over, but Kirishima seemed determined to draw his attention back to the article, and by extension, what could have happened. What else might have gone horribly wrong, how he could have ended up with more effing blood on his hands. "That's kind of my point," Ijuru said slowly, tapping the article. "Look here. He dragged a finger along the line as he read aloud. "A pro-hero of Ground Zero's caliber exercises consistent control over his quirk to ensure the safety of civilians and villains being taken into custody. To imply otherwise belittles the time and effort of many pro-heroes like Ground Zero, whose quirks, in the wrong hands, could become terrible weapons of mass destruction." "Yeah, the writer is calling me a FNGWMD, Katsuki snapped. "What an a-hole." Ijuru was giving Katsuki that look that said even his patience had its limits. "It's a good article, man." I was surprised. I kind of expected it to be a dark, gritty piece. He shrugged, leaning over to look at the article contemplatively. This Deku guy didn't even bring up that thing in Setagaya, which was surprising. Katsuki scowled. That's because there's nothing to FNG say about Setagaya. Idru was giving him that look again, the worried sad look like he wanted to share a warm, fuzzy, emotionally cathartic moment with Katsuki. But he didn't say anything, instead tapping the paper. This guy's good, he said, he really gets heroes. I've seen some of his other stuff. He's not like your typical writer. Katsuki scoffed. Why, because he doesn't see all heroes as gods and all villains as demons? Idru winced a little. Okay, yeah, so admittedly the bar for good hero journalism is pretty low, but dash. Exactly. He doesn't get my approval just for managing to treat pro-heroes like people, Katsuki scoffed, his eyes scanning the page as he said it, his eyes catching the final paragraph of the article. As a hero who closely guards his personal life, Ground Zero remains an enigmatic, if intriguing, public figure. But there is a fine line between fascination and fanaticism. Claiming to act on behalf of a hero with whom few can claim more than passing acquaintance shows us the arrogance of Countdown, but also reminds us how little we truly know about Ground Zero. In these uncertain times, the public demands answers now more than ever. It's time for the hero to decide if he's going underground, or if he's prepared to step into the spotlight alongside his peers and finally answer the question, who is Ground Zero? The world eagerly awaits his answer. Katsuki glowered at the paper with a sneer. Who the F was this Deku guy, trying to call him out? He seems like he's just trying to piss me off with this, he noted irritably. I don't like it when DMN nosy reporters go on about all that the public deserves to know shit. They just want to have better articles than their competitors, that's all. It's still about winning and losing, only no FING lives are at stake, so why should I care? Kirishima shrugged awkwardly, taking another sip of his tea. I don't think this reporter is like that, though. He isn't blaming you for the attack, just wondering how you'll respond to it, I think. Yeah, sure, and Setagaya was no big deal, Katsuki snorted. All the media wants is a good story, they don't actually care what it's about, or even if it's true. Idru set his mug down hard. Bro, did you even read the article? Don't have to, Katsuki shot back, resisting the urge to crumple the newspaper, but only just. Reporters are assholes. Sighing, Kirishima pinched the bridge of his nose. It's too early for this, he decided, and we both need sleep. He glanced at the newspaper again. Maybe give it another read in the morning? Later this morning? It's the first good press I've seen about you since Dash. How the F is reporting on my failure good press? Katsuki snarled, slamming his palm flat down on the counter. It's not about that. Idru protested. I tried to tell you, I was expecting a dark, gritty article, but it's not. Idru exclaimed, rapping the paper insistently with his knuckles. It's bright. Almost hopeful. Like whoever's writing it really believes in heroes. Or believes in you at least. Idru smiled weakly, leaning back in his chair. That's why I wanted you to read it, Shirke. He sighed, a huff of half-amusement escaping his lips. I was hoping you'd realize you've got one reporter out there who's not looking to instantly demonize you. Katsuki snorted dismissively at that, not swayed by Idru's words in the slightest. What did he know about bad press, anyway? Eyeing the picture just below the headline told Katsuki everything he needed to know about the article. He and his imposter were facing each other, but you could only see Katsuki's face. His teeth were bared in a feral expression, his eyes filled with rage, fists clenched and smoking ominously. He was amazed the photographer, the tagline said his name was Atsuma, had managed to capture an image that perfectly encapsulated how he felt about the whole DMN day. And the stupid article too. Why the F couldn't the media just leave him the hell alone? Izuku dragged himself out of bed early to get ready, only to find himself stressing out about what to wear. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't like the pancake restaurant had a dress code or anything, but he still felt nervous. And so he had emptied about half of his closet onto his bed, agonizing about what to put on his body. He'd finally settled on a pair of dark navy chinos, a cotton button-down shirt in a solid teal, and now he was trying to decide between his candy-red sneakers and a pair of caramel-brown loafers. He lifted one pair of shoes in his right hand, turning his head to eye them carefully. Then, he turned and lifted the other pair, scrutinizing them also. He couldn't decide, but after a few more agonizing minutes of indecision, he decided to err on the side of formality and went with the loafers. That decided, Izuku hustled himself out the door. He needed to get to Harajuku on time. He'd been the one to invite Ground Zero to lunch, so he didn't want to be late this time. He did slow for a moment on his way to the station to pick up a copy of the newspaper with his article on the front page. He felt almost giddy. It was his first really big article since he'd started working there several years prior. Even better, he'd gotten his article paired with one of Utsuma's photos. It was dynamic and engaging, drawing the reader's eye inexorably to the page, and by extension, Izuku's article. He grinned down at the newspaper, before tucking it into his bag he had slung over one shoulder. He didn't need to read the article, though in all honesty he'd written in such a fog of sleep deprivation and residual adrenaline that he barely remembered sitting down at his work computer, much less what he'd written. Still, he wanted to hold on to it, just for a little while, to bask in the glow of such a momentous occasion. He knew without question that his mother had already cut out the article and stuck it in one of her many scrapbooks full of memories, but this was for him to enjoy. After all, it wasn't like he could celebrate his front-page article with friends. Besides the fact that he wrote under a false name, most of his friends were pro-heroes, and it felt petty to be celebrating something like this when it was a result of a bad day on their end. No, Izuku would just enjoy his accomplishment on his own, and later in the evening, when his mother would likely call to congratulate him. He hopped off the train at Harajuku Station, amazed at the crowd of people there. He wasn't sure why it caught him so off guard. Harajuku was always crowded and he hadn't really been expecting anything less. On the other hand, it was hard to fully understand or recall the sensation of being surrounded by crowds until they were actually pressing in on him from every side. He glanced around, trying to spot Bakugo, but he couldn't make out more than a faceless mob headed away from the station platforms and swarming towards Takashita Street in one direction, others heading up the stairs, angling for a quick route to Omota-Sando, or intending to transfer at the nearby Meiji Jingume station. It was chaos, and Izuku allowed himself to be carried along with the crowds to the Takashita exit. He peeled off to the side right before the ticket gates and leaned against a pillar, watching the hallway slowly empty of people as the initial crush of bodies exiting the trains above dwindled. He stood there waiting, trying to spot the pro-hero he'd invited to lunch, and absently wondering if Bakugo would be wearing the same ratty jeans and sweatshirt he had been sporting for their morning excursion to Starbucks at the Shibuya Scramble. "Oi, nerd, why the F are you staring at those losers?" A gruff voice barked from just behind his right shoulder, and Izuku whirled around with a yelp, throwing his hands up as if warding off a blow. Staring down at him, appearing nonplussed, was Bakugo. He was wearing a V-neck t-shirt in a deep maroon, an unbuttoned leather vest with several chains and pockets sort of poking out here and there, and black ripped skinny jeans. He wore heavy black leather boots with so many chains and bangles on them Izuku couldn't begin to imagine how the pro-hero had snuck up on him. The monstrosities had to jangle with every step, they had to. To top off the weird look, Bakugo was wearing a spiked choker on his neck in addition to several long chains dipping down from his collarbone to just below his sternum. To complete the look, Bakugo had several spiked bracelets on each forearm, and appeared to be wearing heavy eyeliner. Izuku couldn't seem to find his tongue for several long seconds as he looked the pro-hero up and down. For his part, Bakugo sneered back at him, appearing to scrutinize Izuku with equal deliberation. "Nice shirt," Bakugo finally said, referring to Izuku's button-down. "You look nondescript. You look like you walked out of a punk rock concert." Izuku shot back, "What the hell?" Bakugo's face wrinkled in consternation as he considered Izuku's comment. "It's my day off, and I'm in Harajuku. Who here would even give half a f about what I'm wearing?" It was true, but Izuku looked at Bakugo once more, still somewhat taken aback by the transformation. Sure, Bakugo had worn a lot of black before, but this wasn't just black clothes, this was something else. "Are we going to go eat your precious FING pancakes or not? I didn't come here just to stand inside a train station with my thumbs up my butt," Bakugo snapped irritably, "Let's fucking go." Izuku bobbed his head quickly, tapping his transit card on the ticket gate's reader and hurrying through to the exit. Right, let's go, he agreed quickly. The restaurant is this way, he pointed, and Bakugo grunted. Lead the way, nerd. Izuku did just that. Katsuki would never admit to it, but he felt a surge of relief upon spotting the smaller man waiting for him at Harajuku Station. Seeing Midoriya was a welcome reminder that he really was okay, and that yesterday's events hadn't led to any serious injuries for the green-haired nerd. The guy was scanning the crowds, probably looking for Bakugo. Smirking, Bakugo confronted him, and was surprised to see the flicker of interest in the nerd's eyes as they raked over Bakugo's form. He'd almost forgotten that most people didn't know he dressed like an emo band dropout, as Kirishima referred to it, whenever he got around to putting an effort into his appearance. Usually it was just jeans and t-shirts, but when Katsuki went all out, he really went all out. It seemed that the nerd hadn't expected him to wear something so complicated. Hell, he'd probably been expecting Katsuki to show up in another pair of jeans and a t-shirt. Still, the nerd had put in a bit more effort himself, though he almost stood out more than Katsuki in a place as loud and chaotic as Harajuku, cutting a silhouette that practically screamed, average loser. It was oddly endearing that even when dressing up, Midoriya still came across as painfully plebeian. As his gaze swept over the coffee nerd once more, his eyes landed on the corner of a newspaper poking out of the bag slung over Midoriya's shoulder, just enough to reveal the end of a headline that Katsuki recognized far too easily. Had the guy really gone and picked up a newspaper about the event, even though he'd been there? What a nerd! Katsuki tried to tell himself that was the only reason he felt annoyance rising in him, and not because he was upset that Midoriya might have actually taken anything in the stupid article to heart. Or worse, was the green-eyed a-hole as stupid as Kirishima, blindly believing that the reporter had been motivated by seeking the truth or some bullshit? God, Katsuki had come along wanting to forget all about the FNG thing, and now here it was again. Before Katsuki had reached a decision on how to react to this new development, or if he even should react to it, Midoriya turned off the main street, heading into a building complex before coming to a stop and glancing around in confusion. Where did the elevator go? He asked himself, as if the elevator had sprouted legs and ambled away in a fit of boredom. Katsuki sniggered at the mental image, only to have the green nerd whirl around and make a face at him. You could help instead of laughing at me, he groused. We have a reservation to make, and I've only been here once before, like 2 years ago. With a start, Katsuki realized that Midoriya looked tired. His face was paler than he remembered, and he was sporting dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept enough. Katsuki hadn't meant to seem like an a-hole, this time, but seeing that haggard face, if Midoriya was trying to keep it together, what right did he have to try and make things harder for the DM nerd? He didn't bother trying to explain that he hadn't been laughing at the nerd specifically, because that wasn't the point, frankly. It wasn't worth the breath to try and explain what had really amused him. Instead, Katsuki threw out a muttered, I didn't even care that much about pancakes in the first place, making a half-hearted show of looking around the ground floor for a sign that said, elevator. We could just grab ramen or whatever, I don't give a f dash dot. Yeah, that much is obvious, Midoriya shot back, rolling his eyes. Your mouth is doing twice the work your eyes should be doing, he replied, striding over to a building map on the wall. Oh, come on. The restaurant isn't even listed on the directory. He grimaced at the map like he expected it to apologize for the inconvenience. Is it on one of the upper levels? Katsuki asked carefully, following the nerd over to look at the map, frowning. He came to a stop just behind the other, leaning just a little to look over the nerd's bouncy green mop. What a disastrous haircut. It was almost as unruly as Katsuki's, and that was saying something, as most stylists would despair at the mere sight of Katsuki's cowlick-cursed scalp. It should be on the 14th floor, I just wanted to be sure this was the right building, Midoriya complained, before scowling, pointing at a small notation in the corner of the floor plan. God damn it, this is building 1, we need building 2, no wonder I couldn't find the elevator. He whirled around to walk away from the map, not bothering to watch where he was going. Unfortunately, this meant that he found himself crashing into Katsuki's chest in his haste to get away from the map and figure out where they were meant to be. His nose smashed right into Katsuki's collarbone, and he stiffened as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over him. Midoriya backed up swiftly until he crashed into the wall, hands going up defensively. "Thing hell! Get off!" Katsuki blinked, then lifted his hands slowly in a gesture of surrender. "All I effin' did was stand here and watch you fail to find a shitty but pancake restaurant," he said impatiently, "so can you maybe effing chill?" Midoriya blinked in surprise, like he hadn't even expected his own reaction. He scrubbed at his face with a sigh, shoulders slumping. "You're right," he admitted, "I definitely ran into you, sorry, my nerves got the better of me." He still looked tense, even though his hands were no longer balled into fists. "It's been a rough couple of days," Katsuki said awkwardly, not really sure how to be comforting and sure as hell not comfortable doing anything touchy-feely. That was some Kirishima fuckery. Katsuki didn't do that shit. Midoriya snorted at Katsuki's understatement. "Yeah," he agreed, then his head popped back up, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Building 2 must be that way," he pointed behind Katsuki's shoulder and slightly to the left. "Let's go." He breezed past Katsuki, once more set on a course for goddamn pancakes. Katsuki couldn't seem to shake the sense that something was off, though. The reason why hit him a moment later, when he realized that this wasn't the first time he'd seen Midoriya like this. The first time they'd met too, Midoriya had seemed tense. At the time, Katsuki had chalked it up to annoyance, but this was twice now, twice. That he recalled Midoriya getting defensive when he was crowded up against a wall. Katsuki may not have been the most perceptive person alive, but he knew enough about victim psychology to recognize that this sort of behavior wasn't nothing. Some part of him clenched in anger as he began to ponder who had treated Midoriya so badly that he instinctively expected bad things to happen when a bigger, more physically imposing person stood too close to him. Another part of him decided that, for now, he would just try to give Midoriya a bit more space. Katsuki might be an a-hole, but even he wasn't so much of an a-hole as to recognize someone's discomfort and push the envelope. That was a bad example. Katsuki definitely enjoyed making people uncomfortable. Just not like this. Not when it made them afraid. "I found it." Midoriya crowed from across the hall, before tacking on a pointed, "No thanks to you," though his tone wasn't really that accusatory. Still, it was obnoxious. "F you," Katsuki shot back as he wandered over. "This was your idea, I don't gotta do shit." "And you didn't," Midoriya retorted, "so stop being a baby about it." He pointed. "Found the elevator too." Katsuki walked over and stabbed the up button with his finger, sighing heavily before grumbling, "Congratulations," with a pointed look in the nerd's direction. The door chimed as it opened. He gestured grandly at the double doors, with just enough flair to show Midoriya that he considered this doing his part to get their pancake adventure off the ground. "After you." Midoriya gave him a look that seemed to say pressing a button didn't count as helping, but he breezed into the elevator without further comment, and Katsuki followed him a moment later, suppressing a sigh. These pancakes better be FING worth it. It didn't take long for them to be seated, at which point Bakugo picked up the menu with a sneer. "There better be savory fucking pancakes or I'm not eating," he declared, threatened, scarlet eyes flicking rapidly across the menu. Izuku was caught between the urge to smirk and the desire to glower. He'd told Bakugo that they had savory pancakes. Why would he lie about something so easily disprovable? Not only did the restaurant have a sizable savory pancake list, they were DMN delicious, if Izuku's memory could be relied upon. After all, he'd come here before with... For a moment, Izuku scowled, trying to remember who it was he'd accompanied here. One of the people he'd met at UA, someone in the hero course, probably. Obviously, he didn't have a lot of personal connections to people who'd been in the hero course, though being able to guilt pro-heroes about not remembering that they'd shared years at UA with him was a great way to eke out interviews upon introduction. But it still took a moment of mentally sifting through who he might have accompanied to lunch before his mind called up the memory of Todoroki poking his vegetable pancake with a distrustful look that melted into a look of pleasant surprise upon nibbling at his first bite. It made sense, too, since Todoroki's agency wasn't too far from this place. They'd probably had a lunch meeting about an article or something. Speaking of article, Izuku felt his eyes drift unbidden to his bag and the paper tucked into it. He wondered if Bakugo had seen the article yet. He'd worked his butt off to get interviews for it, and he'd known better than to bother asking Ground Zero for a comment. If his reputation hadn't been enough to keep Izuku from bothering him, the look on the pro-hero's face as they'd been wrapping up had told him all he needed to know. Ground Zero would have turned his quirk on himself before giving a single comment. Not that Izuku blamed him, he decided, picking up his own menu and glancing through it. It had to have been horrible, seeing the way Countdown had clung to all of the worst parts of Ground Zero's image when constructing the false identity. The actual story would have been much more boring if it hadn't been for the copycat attempt. Countdown, as he had dubbed himself, he'd refused to give another name until the police had run his fingerprints and learned his real name, was nothing more than a disgruntled former employee of the very Shine Media group he'd bombed. His quirk allowed him to create countdown locks on things, where he could control the length of time before something opened, fell, released, transmitted, or took any other kind of action. There hadn't been a traditional detonator, just signals going out that Countdown had locked to release when he chose to release them, rather than locking the C4 specifically. That way he could control when each signal released, rather than focusing on scattered piles of C4 individually. Fortunately, the man needed physical contact to activate or deactivate his quirk, which explained why Ground Zero had knocked the detonator from his hands. It also explained why he hadn't set off the C4 using only his quirk, since he would have been caught in the blast of the plastic explosives. It also explained why they'd been so careful to avoid him touching anything. A man who could lock or unlock a state of something at will simply by touching it was tremendously dangerous. For not the first time, Izuku thought to himself that it would have been a nice quirk to have been born with, something that powerful might have been enough to get him into UA's hero course. But instead the villain had used his gift for an act of petty revenge, injuring innocents and causing massive property damage. It was infuriating to see that wasted potential. Probably because Izuku had no potential to waste. Pepper jelly with cream cheese? Or kimchi pork with extra spicy sauce? The question startled Izuku from his reverie. He'd almost forgotten he'd come here with someone else. The look of irritation on Bakugo's face as he waited for Izuku to respond made it clear he'd realized Izuku had forgotten he was there. A man with a personality as forceful as Bakugo's probably wouldn't take such an insult lightly. Do you prefer cream cheese or meat? Izuku asked, trying to refocus on the conversation at hand. It's all food, Bakugo replied dismissively, scowling at the menu like it was a personal affront. Izuku glanced back down at his own menu, realizing that if Bakugo had narrowed his choices down to two, he should probably at least finish looking at his menu. Do you like pepper jelly or kimchi? I love spicy food, Bakugo replied, which is why I can't decide. Well, pepper jelly is usually sweet and spicy, so if you want to avoid something sweet you should probably stick to the kimchi pork, Izuku suggested. Bakugo made a non-committal grunt. What are you getting? Izuku glanced frantically over his options. I might get the souffle-style traditional maple and whipped butter pancake with fresh fruit. Bakugo gave him a look. Why the hell would you go to a fancy pancake place and order something you could get anywhere? He demanded. I don't know, I like maple syrup and butter. Izuku shot back, feeling inordinately defensive about his menu selection. He just said this one because it was the first thing he saw that sounded good, but with Bakugo getting all obnoxious about it, he could feel his stubbornness rise up in him. Damn it, now he wanted the pancake because for some reason Bakugo thought it was a bad choice and he felt the need to prove something by ordering the traditional style pancake. Fucking boring, Bakugo grumbled, setting his menu down. You ready to order? Izuku scowled back at him, slapping his own menu down. Yeah. They put in their orders when the waiter dropped by their table, Izuku ordering his boring pancake with a mild sneer in Bakugo's direction as he did so. Bakugo ordered some Hojicha green tea as his beverage while Izuku went with a Darjeeling milk tea, and after receiving their drinks, both sat back to wait for their food, staring at the other. Bakugo broke the silence first, leaning back in the booth and eyeing Izuku appraisingly. You sure you're okay? He asked carefully. That was intense yesterday. It's fine, Izuku assured him. I'm just glad you were there, or it could have ended a lot worse. As much as the man irritated him, at least he was good at his job. No one could deny that. Bakugo's face slackened in surprise before he quickly schooled it back into a neutral expression. Oh sure. I mean, it's my job. That wasn't at all the reaction Izuku had expected from him. I heard it was a copycat, Izuku added hesitantly, some guy who used to work for Shine Media, who felt like you'd both been victimized by the company. Bakugo suddenly seemed incredibly taken by his tea, staring into the depths of his cup. It's fucking bullshit, he declared. Which part? Izuku pressed. The fact that some criminal tried to emulate you, or that the media has been all over you? Bakugo set his cup down hard enough to rattle the table. Both? He snapped, his crimson eyes practically incandescent with rage. Sometimes heroes don't want to bear their FING soul to a bunch of assholes who want to exploit their mistakes to make a FANG buck. He growled something unintelligible under his breath before adding, "You reporters," in a harsh tone. Suddenly Izuku was the one taken with his tea. Did he know? Izuku had been evacuated with civilians, but he'd definitely seen Ground Zero here and there while he'd been interviewing other heroes that had been on the scene. Had Bakugo realized he was one of those assholes trying to sell a story of his misfortune? Izuku felt his stomach clench, no longer pleased with his front-page accomplishment. Had he really made Bakugo that much more miserable, just by doing his job? Don't be like that, Bakugo snapped. I didn't want to. I came for pancakes, not to whine about my shitty life. He made a face, letting out a strangled, "That's sorry," after a moment. Izuku's head whipped up so fast he made himself dizzy. Did you just apologize? He asked incredulously. Not if you're gonna be like that about it, Bakugo shot back with a haughty sneer. Just fucking. I'm tired and pissy today, don't take it personally. Izuku laughed at that, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't meant to laugh, but, are there days when you're not tired and pissy? He asked, grinning cheekily. F you. Bakugo replied in an almost conversational tone, trying to hide his own smile behind his teacup as he took another sip. It was at this moment their pancakes arrived, and the two eyed their respective plates appraisingly. Izuku smeared the whipped butter on his steaming pancake before drowning it in maple syrup. He looked up to see Bakugo taking a tentative bite of the kimchi pork pancake. Bakugo's eyes widened slightly. Not FING terrible, he commented. I guess I stand corrected. Coming here wasn't a complete waste of time. Izuku rolled his eyes. Nice to know my company doesn't sway your opinion of wasting time one way or the other, but food is apparently the deciding factor. Well, I was going to be spending time with you either way, so it was more a matter of whether this restaurant was worth the time, since bearing with you was already a given, Bakugo explained matter-of-factly before taking another bite of his pancake. Izuku considered this for a moment. I can accept that, he decided. I am sorry about yesterday though. Hard as it was for me, I'm sure it was worse for you. Yeah, well, the effing worst of it was realizing you were seconds from being an afterthought on the asphalt, Bakugo grunted, eyes fixed on his pancake. Most of my friends are heroes, so seeing them in danger is kind of a given. He frowned. It was bad seeing someone else I knew in danger too. Izuku swallowed hard, finding it hard to do so around the lump in his throat. That's it. I'm glad you were there, or it could have ended a whole lot worse than it did. He sighed. I guess I owe you my thanks, don't I? Bakugo's frown deepened into a scowl as he looked up. I was just doing my job, he replied. Even so, Izuku insisted, feeling like he had to say something in the wake of Bakugo's unexpected vulnerability. I realized a long time ago that no matter how much you want it to be true, there won't always be a hero to save you when things go wrong. Bakugo's face twisted, and his mouth opened like he was about to object, but Izuku continued, hurrying to explain. So I guess what I'm saying is, thanks for reminding me that it doesn't mean a hero will never save me. He smiled weakly. Some days that can be hard to remember. But now I can hold on to that memory of you saving me. I think it'll help when I'm having a hard time. So, thanks. His smile widened as he added a soft, "You're my hero, Bakugo Katsuki. I won't forget that." Katsuki stared at those bright, shining eyes, the words "You're my hero, Bakugo Katsuki" ringing in his ears. "What the f***? Don't," he said hoarsely, "I'm not. I just keep losing though, so why would you say that?" It didn't make sense. Midoriya had been there to see his imposter. How could he have so completely missed the fact that all of it was his fault? Losing? Midoriya frowned. "You caught the villain though." "He was a villain because of me," Bakugo snarled, feeling almost defensive. Was he trying to hoard his shame? If Midoriya didn't think it was his fault, why was he trying to impress upon the smaller man that this whole disaster was his fault? Maybe because he couldn't stand to be idolized for something he didn't earn. He had no right to be venerated for this colossal F-up, so having Midoriya try to make him feel better about it stung. But police said he was a disgruntled former employee. Midoriya reminded him, a flash of irritation crossing his face as he wrinkled a freckled nose at Bakugo. Bakugo sighed. He didn't know how to explain. Yeah, but he still chose my image as the vehicle of his revenge. So even if Ground Zero wasn't the actual motivation behind the attack, I still feel FING responsible for it. Midoriya stared at his pancake for a minute, dragging a bite-sized piece of it through a puddle of syrup without making any effort to bring it to his mouth. "I guess I hadn't considered that," he murmured, then lifted his eyes to stare at Katsuki, a sharp glint in their depths. "But that doesn't mean you should carry all of that on your own shoulders." Bakugo scowled at the guy with hair the color of blanched spinach and snorted. I don't have to clear that sort of thing with you." He opened his mouth to continue, and realized belatedly that saying, "I can feel miserable about my failures as much as I decide to and no one has the right to stop me," probably wasn't the sort of thing to get the green need to lay off. "It can do whatever I want," he finished lamely, quickly stuffing another bite of fluffy but satisfyingly dense pancake in his mouth before he said any more dumb shit. "You think you should be allowed to wallow in misery because sometimes people are shitty?" Midoriya said, his tone biting. "What the F dash?" Katsuki growled around a mouthful of pancake. "Why should you be allowed to tell me whether or not I can be set off it myself?" Midoriya opened his mouth to respond, thought better of it, and shoved the syrup-soaked piece of pancake in his mouth, washing it down with a mouthful of milk tea. His eyes never left Katsuki, calculating. "You're right," he finally said, "I can't make you not be set off it yourself. But if all that frustration does is keep you up at night, if it's not something to help you move forward, then you're just holding yourself back." Katsuki felt his hackles raise at this. "What the F would you know about holding yourself back?" he snarled, more out of defensiveness than actual anger, but Midoriya jerked like he'd been struck. His hands tightened into fists. "I always wanted to be a hero," he said hesitantly, dropping his head to stare at his pancake. "I hated myself for a long time, for not having a quirk. I blamed myself every time something bad happened that I couldn't fix." His voice shook as he continued. "I got hurt so many times, trying to help, trying to do the right thing, trying to be something I could never be." He lifted his eyes, slowly meeting Katsuki's gaze. "It took me a long time to figure out my place in this world, a world full of wonderful quirks for everyone but me." He chuckled mirthlessly. "Some days I think I'm still looking for more than what I've found." He sighed, glancing back down at his pancake. "But it wasn't until I let go of my impossible dream that I discovered a dream I could achieve." Katsuki swallowed hard. "I should have realized you went to, even though you're quirkless." Midoriya made a face. "I even tried to take the entrance exam for the hero course," he said, a wistful expression on his face. "I managed to rescue one person, pulling them out of the way of falling debris." He shrugged, looking sheepish. Obviously, that wasn't enough to qualify. Katsuki winced, remembering how he'd plowed through the robots without a second thought for collateral damage. He'd been a stupid kid. "I didn't save a single person," he confessed. Midoriya burst out laughing. "Oh my God, that doesn't even surprise me," he choked out through a peal of laughter. "You were so goddamn obsessed with winning that first year. Do you remember the sports festival? That sports festival was effing bullshit." Katsuki snarled, probably reacting a bit more defensively than was warranted. Not that he'd FANG admit it. I only won because that DMN mind control freak made all his opponents walk out of the ring. I just refused to talk to him and blasted his butt. It was a FING meaningless victory. Who the hell would be happy with something like that? Midoriya laughed. I was just happy I made it to the second round. When I saw all those people using their quirks, I was certain I'd come in last place. He grinned. It was a pretty interesting sports festival, though. I guess, Katsuki grumbled, taking another bite of gloriously spicy pancake. Demon, it was FNG good. Midoriya swirled his milk tea in his cup for a moment, then took another sip. I think it was 3/4 through that first year when I finally realized I was never going to get into the hero course. He laughed. You would think it would have been immediately obvious, but I was. Blinded by optimism? Katsuki ventured. I was going to say determined, but you're probably closer to the truth, Midoriya chuckled. You seem like the type, Bakugo replied with a hint of a sneer. Don't tell me you're the kind of person who gets people to tell them all about their problems so you can fix them. Those green eyes stared back at him, unblinking, for a long moment. I wanted to be a DMN hero, Bakugo. What do you think? Katsuki dropped his head down to the tabletop with a satisfying thunk. I've made a terrible decision, he declared, as if Kirishima wasn't enough. Now I have 2 meddling do-gooders in my life trying to fix me. Midoriya huffed like he was offended at the accusation. I don't try to fix people, he protested. I try to let them feel like someone understands them and cares about them. Same thing, Bakugo shot back, lifting his head just to smirk at the green nerd, because it was fun trying to get under his skin. It is not dash, he paused, eyeing Bakugo with a look of suppressed irritation. You're enjoying this? Pissing you off? Oh, definitely, Katsuki answered, enjoying the way Midoriya's face flushed at the admission. I'm not sad, the green-haired man said primly, before narrowing his eyes in Katsuki's direction, adding, trust me, you'd know if I was. Something about the glint in the nerd's eyes told Bakugo that he wasn't exaggerating that fact. They left the restaurant together in companionable silence, both of them overfull from gorging themselves on delicious pancakes. Upon their exit, Midoriya glanced around, noting the blue sky and mild temperature with pleasure. It was a really nice day outside. I have the rest of today off, he said, glancing at the obnoxious blonde who had dressed like spontaneous punk rock concerts just sort of happened when you went out. What about you? It's my day off too, Bakugo replied, sounding guarded. His eyes narrowed slightly. This isn't some shitty, let's cheer up ground zero because he's moping bullshit, is it? He demanded, suspicion coloring his tone. Midoriya considered that accusation for a few seconds. I mean, I suppose it could be if you wanted that. No. Bakugo spat, his eyes flashing. Then it isn't, Izuku told him calmly. It's just, look up. The sky is so bright blue and the air is so fresh and clean, I really want to take a walk, don't you? Ha! Bakugo was staring at him like he had a strange growth between his eyes. Why the hell would we take a walk? What's the point of it? Izuku blinked a few times. He cannot be serious. You're kidding, right? Unfortunately, it seemed the pro-hero was painfully sincere in his total social ineptitude. Why the F would you go for a walk? It's the worst kind of exercise, no cardio, it barely even counts as a bodyweight exercise dash. Izuku couldn't help but laugh, and then once he started laughing, it was hard to stop. He giggled, and Bakugo paused mid-lecture to glower at him. Izuku kept chortling as Bakugo's mouth opened and closed a few times, trying to find words. Finally, the blonde snarled, flexing his fingers in a way that seemed almost like when he was trying to activate his quirk. What the F is so goddamn hilarious? He demanded. Izuku was nearly in tears at this point, doubling over and clutching his stomach in the throes of his mirth. You, he gasped, walk, exercise, was all he managed before once again dissolving into giggles. What the actual F dash? Bakugo spun around, glaring at passers-by like he suspected there was something sinister afoot. Did you get hit by a laughing quirk? He demanded, a thread of anxiety pulling taut in his tone. Quick, he commanded, extending his hand. Slap my palm twice if you're laughing uncontrollably. For a moment, Izuku considered slapping his hand, but the idea that Bakugo genuinely thought he might be in danger was sobering enough that he was able to regain his composure after a few shuddering breaths. I wasn't suggesting exercise, he explained, giving Bakugo a look of amusement. I just think that walking around and seeing things in nice weather is enjoyable. Bakugo frowned like he couldn't quite see the connection between walking and enjoyable. But it's not exciting. No, Izuku agreed, it's clarifying. Calming. Not chaotic or stressful at all. It's relaxing. He nudged Bakugo with his elbow playfully. Don't tell me you've never gone for a walk before. I would go for a run late at night when something was bothering me, Bakugo confessed, his brow furrowing as he thought. I don't usually walk places though. Except from point A to point B. Izuku considered this. I guess you are a pro hero, so just casual strolling probably isn't your thing, is it? Bakugo shook his head slowly, then turned to Izuku with a sneer. You'd better teach me the right way to do it, then. Izuku felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he glanced over at the blonde. I guess I could. He bobbed his head in the general direction of Meiji Shrine. Let's go. The green nerd took the lead, effortlessly slipping through the crowds while Katsuki took a more direct approach, shoulder-checking people who got in his way and scowling at anyone who looked ready to protest the harsh treatment. Before long they were striding beneath the wooden gate, Midoriya pausing briefly to bow before entering, Katsuki marching ahead without so much as slowing his gait. If the gods wanted to FNG Beach about his disrespect, they could just give him more shitty luck. After all, his last Omikuji fortune-telling result had been FANG terrible, and based on the events of the last few days, he highly doubted that his luck was improving. He could have bought an Omamori good luck charm, but he had a feeling that between his being far from devout and the unlikelihood of his putting any faith in the charm, it would likely fail to be a worthwhile investment. Midoriya trotted up beside him, and waved his hand to indicate one of the paths that angled away from the main route and looped around the sprawling shrine complex, probably angling to walk through the inner garden, rather than heading for the main shrine. How about we walk that way? He suggested. Fine, Katsuki replied shortly, stretching his legs into wide, rapid strides. It was only about 10 steps later that he felt a gentle tug at his sleeve. Slow down, Midoriya was saying, his eyes crinkling slightly with amusement. It's not a race. If it was, I'd be winning, Katsuki replied with a smirk, though he slowed his pace to a more sedate walk. It felt unnatural. He didn't stroll places, he was always moving with swift intent. Even in his shared apartment with Kirishima, he didn't putter around much. It felt off-putting to force his legs to hold back. He scowled at Midoriya. Why don't you just hurry up? He grumbled. Because. Midoriya spread his arms wide. I'm enjoying the view. Look at these trees. They're so tall. Who FNG cares? Katsuki shot back. They're trees. Midoriya's green eyes snapped to him. You really don't know how to relax, he said accusingly, and that rubbed Katsuki the wrong way. Who the hell was this little sheet to tell him what he couldn't do? He knew how to relax just fucking fine, he just didn't see the goddamn point of it. He could be the most relaxed FING person in the world if he wanted to be. To prove the point, he glanced up at the goddamn FNG trees. They were still just FING trees. What the hell was so relaxing about giant sprouting things that soaked up all the sunlight? Even as he thought it, they were moving beyond the tall trees into the garden area proper. It was plants. And a pond. Just more FNG sprouting things and goddamn water. What the hell was supposed to be relaxing about an oversized puddle and fancy plants? He turned to the green nerd with a scowl, but the guy with the FNG shrubbery atop his own diamond head seemed taken by the FNG plants. There's a duck, he exclaimed excitedly, pointing. It's cute. It was a FING sheep-producing menace, probably contaminating the water, and had the potential to be a noisy annoyance, but sure. Cute. Whatever. He was about to say as much, but something about the look on Midoriya's face made him stop. He was genuinely enjoying his stupid walk, and for whatever reason, Katsuki didn't feel like ruining the moment by pointing out how goddamn stupid ducks were. So instead, he just grunted, since that sort of sound could be interpreted however the DMN nerd wanted it to be. He followed the green-haired menace around the pond for the better part of a FING hour, forcing himself to take slow steps, maintaining his slow but pace and trying to look at the things that Midoriya looked at with a similar perspective. It didn't FING work, since it was all just plants, rocks, and FING water, but he at least tried to enjoy it. Mostly he enjoyed watching Midoriya lose his sheet over rocks and ducks and other bullshit because it was hilarious. Who the hell actually enjoyed looking at FNG water that goddamn much? Apparently this stupid green guy, that's who. Still, as much as Katsuki was loath to admit it, he felt refreshed, somehow, after walking through the goddamn garden. Not that he would ever admit as much to FNG shrubbery hair. When Bakugo started sighing every time Izuku stopped to look at another part of the garden, he figured he was nearing the limits of the pro-hero's patience. The guy was a goddamn adrenaline junkie. Not that this was at all surprising considering his line of work, but it helped keep Izuku from getting too irritated at his antics. Bakugo would wrinkle his nose whenever Midoriya tried to call things elegant, or cute, or really talk about any of the scenery at all, but he'd been courteous enough to keep his real thoughts to himself, which was honestly more than Midoriya expected. He knew that Bakugo wasn't a UA student anymore, but it was still hard to divorce the current Bakugo from his image of a Bakugo who didn't give a shit about what anyone thought and would say whatever the hell he wanted anytime, threatening to murder anyone who didn't like it. It wasn't fair, but he'd been in UA for 3 DMN years, and Bakugo had a reputation as the all-school menace for a reason. Still, Izuku felt bad about trying Bakugo's patience, especially since he was trying so hard to relax and not immediately leave the garden. He turned to look at Bakugo, whose shoulders had managed to grow a bit less stiff in the time since they'd walked in, and considered that victory enough. "Hey," he said hesitantly, "you ready to head out?" Bakugo's eyes said he'd never wanted to come in the first place, but all he said aloud was, "Yeah, whatever," which was actually pretty nice for him, considering he hadn't used any curse words. "Let's go then," Izuku said with a grin, heading for the shrine itself. They could walk out through the shrine, and depart by way of the upper stations instead of walking back the way they'd come. "Do you need JR, Tokyo Metro, or Odaku lines?" "I don't FNG know," Bakugo grumbled. "I guess I'll just stop by my agency's training facilities after this, so dash." Izuku cut him off before he even realized he was doing so. "You go to the gym on your day off?" he demanded. "Why?" Bakugo looked at him like he was an idiot. "To stay in shape," he answered, as if this were obvious. "Don't you need, like, recovery days though?" Izuku asked, though to be perfectly honest he wasn't exactly a fitness expert. He worked out just enough to ensure he could run like hell from active combat zones when necessary, and that was about the extent of his physical capabilities. Bakugo was still looking at him like an idiot, actually slowing his walk to a stop. "I'm not going to do anything that intense," he said, "but I don't see how it's any different than walking around a goddamn pond for an hour, except I'll probably be less likely to develop a pollen allergy in a climate-controlled gym than out here in the great out FING doors." Izuku hadn't really considered that. "Wait, so, you work out for fun too? Not just for training?" Bakugo blinked hard. "What the hell do you mean by training? It was a fair question, since Izuku wasn't really sure himself what he'd meant. "I mean like, you won't be quirk training or whatever?" With a scowl that was only emphasized by the heavy eyeliner Bakugo was wearing, he shook his head. "I can't overuse my quirk, that would be even worse than overtraining my body," he said. "Because if you overdo it you'll end up hurting your arms, right?" Izuku asked, before remembering he probably shouldn't bring up that detail, since that was something not many people actually knew about his quirk. He only knew because in UA he'd been quick to make friends with the people in the support department, so he'd gotten a lot of inside information from that angle. It's amazing how quick the support students were to talk about their projects when you asked about them and actually listened. Bakugo was eyeing Izuku suspiciously. "What makes you say that?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Sighing internally, Izuku answered. "In UA, you had to start using arm braces," he said. "It seems obvious you would only do that if the force of your quirk has the potential to injure your arms. Even from an observer's perspective, It looks like your explosions put a lot of strain on them. He shrugged. I just figured that's probably a drawback to your quirk that would require continuous effort to prevent issues, even after going pro. Slowly, Bakugu's tense shoulders eased, his stance relaxing, eyes growing less guarded as he considered Izuku's words. Fair, he said, then shot him a pointed look. You're DMN observant for a FENG Gen Ed loser, he said. Hey, Izuku protested, don't forget Shinso started out in our class too. Brainfucker is really going to be your claim to fame? Bakugu scoffed. I'm just saying, a lot of people in general education were waiting for the chance to prove themselves. You think we wouldn't be watching the hero courses as closely as possible? Izuku shot him a disbelieving look. Of course we watched you. We gathered all the intel we could, because we wanted to be you. Bakugu's chest puffed with pride at that. Hell yeah you did, he smirked, and Izuku just had to clarify. Well, not you specifically, he explained. You were an a-hole and I think most of my class would have liked nothing better than to see literally anyone else in the hero course wipe the floor with you. We wanted to be like Yaoyorozu or Ida or Todoroki, you know, someone else with fewer attitude problems. Bakugu whirled on Izuku so fast it was almost comical. F you, he snapped. I was the effing best, and you were all just effing jealous, He cut himself off, chuckling. DMN. He eyed Izuku with a smirk. You're an a-hole. Takes one to know one, Izuku replied with a smirk. Bakugu just rolled his eyes at that. Whatever, nerd, he said, once more marching forward, heading towards the shrine. Let's just go, I got FNG workout to get to. Izuku still didn't understand how the hell doing more training qualified as a day off, but he'd poked the bear enough for the moment, so he just shrugged, following Bakugu as he shoved his way through the crowds of visitors to the shrine. Once they had parted ways at JR Harajuku Station, Izuku headed for his apartment, since he really didn't have anything else to do. At least, that's what he thought until his phone danced anxiously in his pocket. He hopped off the train at the next station and dialed his voicemail, only to learn that there was a new discovery of something related to the countdown case, and if he was interested, to head over to the precinct. When was Izuku ever not interested in more information on a case? True, he'd already written the article. But if it was big or led to something big, there was always a chance of writing a follow-up article. Instead of heading home, Izuku looked up the fastest route to the precinct and hopped back on the train. He thought briefly about how he'd given Bakugu grief for training on his day off, and here he was, chasing down a lead on his own day off. But as long as he didn't tell Bakugu about it, there would be no way for the pro-hero to know of his hypocrisy. That decided, Izuku mentally prepared himself for what sort of information it might be. Had Countdown finally revealed the identity of the person who had provided him with the C4 he'd used for his bombs? Or was it some information about the man's arrest record that was more relevant than the police originally believed? Maybe the villain had escaped. It had been known to happen on occasion, and considering the man still had an unknown accomplice supplier, it still wasn't clear to police exactly how close a contact this mysterious C4 provider really was to the villain known as Countdown. Not altogether unlikely. Izuku hoped it was a lead on the C4, because that would actually be interesting. He'd already scoured the police reports, and even if something relevant came up, it wouldn't be enough to write a whole story about, not unless Izuku had somehow missed something really big. But speculation was useless at this point. Instead, Izuku amused himself by staring out the train window and willing the seconds to fly by more quickly. Once he reached the station, Izuku joined the crush of bodies rushing from the crowded platform to the equally crowded streets outside the station. From there, it wasn't far to the station, and Izuku eased inside without garnering so much as a single sideways glance. That was fortunate, since it was never good to advertise your presence if you were a journalist trying to keep a low profile. That was one advantage to being a quirkless guy with nondescript features, Izuku supposed. Midoriya, good to see you, came a booming voice from one of the side rooms, effectively ruining the air of invisibility Izuku had managed to exude upon entry. Still, considering he was something of a regular around here, some attention was unavoidable. Blushing as he hurried across the room, some things were so ingrained over time as to become instinctive, and after years of blushing and cringing under scrutiny, Izuku still hadn't managed to reverse the trait. Izuku shot a dirty look in the direction of Detective Itakazu Sora, his usual contact at this precinct. Could you at least pretend you're trying to be subtle? Izuku griped as he hurried over. Now the whole precinct knows I'm here. I've said it before and I'll say it again, Detective Itakazu said in a tone bordering on condescension. People care a lot more about some shrimpy guy slinking around than they worry about some dude I'm shouting at. I'm always shouting. It's when I'm quiet that people start asking too many questions. As usual, Izuku wasn't sure he bought it, but he also wasn't going to argue. At least, not until after he'd gotten his story. Once he had his scoop, all bets were off. Fine. He tabled the argument for a more opportune moment. So what have you got for me? Right this way, Itakazu said, a hint of a smirk tugging at his roguish features. You're going to love this. Considering the playful gleam in the detective's eyes, Izuku highly doubted that would be the case. After eating crap food and a boring butt walk, Katsuki expected to enjoy a workout and burn off some of the useless pancake calories. What he hadn't expected was to be swarmed by a certain well-intentioned but absolutely smothering friend the minute he walked into the agency's gym. Bakugu! Kirishima cried, dropping his free weights and hopping across the room. What are you doing here? I thought you had a date. Katsuki blinked twice, certain he'd misheard. What? He said flatly. You went on a date? Kirishima sounded less sure this time. Because you said dash. Why the F would I have gone on a goddamn date? Katsuki did not shriek, he merely projected. Shrilly. Well, you said you were meeting someone once already this week, and then you met with someone again this morning dash, Kirishima tried to explain, only for Katsuki to cut him off. What the hell do you know about that? He demanded. The F are you going on about? I didn't, that wasn't dash, growling. Katsuki took a moment to center himself before snarling, who I meet on my own time is none of your goddamn business. Kirishima's eyes practically sparkled. Oh my god, he whispered, almost reverently. I didn't believe Ishido when she told me, but now I know she's right, you're totally secretly dating someone. Katsuki was 5 seconds away from leveling their whole agency with one massive butt explosion. For the last time, he said slowly, am not. F-I-N-G. Dating. Anyone. Not yet, anyway, Kirishima replied with a sunny smile, somehow remaining genuinely happy for Katsuki despite the vehement denial. What the hell is wrong with your ears, you red-haired a-hole? Katsuki demanded with a snarl, half tempted to grab said ears to see if they were even working right. Nothing, man. It's just nice to see some life back in your eyes, Kirishima replied with a wide, guileless grin. I was so worried, but you've got some of that old spark back. I'll show you spark, Katsuki muttered, shooting Kirishima a glare. What the F do you mean life back in my eyes? I'm the same as always. Kirishima shrugged, but his eyes glinted like he knew if he said something, Katsuki wouldn't like it. Sure, if you say so. He obviously didn't agree, but had realized that Katsuki wasn't in the mood to bicker with him. I'm going to work out, he said. You're welcome to come. So long as you stop acting all cryptic and accusing me of going on a goddamn date. I'll stop accusing you of going on secret dates when you admit that's totally what happened, Kirishima shot back. Because man, I don't usually listen to Ishido, but she absolutely nailed this one. You even dressed up. He gestured at Bakuga's face, which still had the DM and eyeliner since he hadn't bothered removing it before changing into gym sweats. Katsuki threw his hands in the air. Forget it, you're banned from the gym while I'm in it. Go and sit in a DM cubicle somewhere and think about what you did. Kirishima just laughed. Sure, man. I had paperwork to fill out anyway. Somehow it felt less satisfying, knowing that Kirishima had been planning to go sit around in his office before Katsuki had told him to do it. But Katsuki smirked after his retreating figure anyway, choosing to see it as a victory regardless. He waited until Kirishima exited the gym, the double doors swinging shut behind him, before heading for the same free weights Kirishima had just dropped. It seemed like a decent place to start, and Katsuki wasn't wasting any more time thinking about Kirishima's baseless accusations. Izuku stared at his notes, glad he'd developed a coded shorthand, otherwise he'd feel distinctly uncomfortable reading it on a public train. The idea that Countdown had been a pawn, just a small piece of what seemed to be a larger conspiracy. Itakazu had emphasized that they didn't have all the details yet, but based on the number of small-time villains they'd brought in, it didn't seem like any of them had the connections to acquire the amount of C4 that had been used in the attack. Someone else, someone better at hiding their trail, had supplied these disenfranchised, frustrated people and manipulated them. Had Countdown even intended to mimic Ground Zero, or had that been part of the mysterious benefactor's plan? Because if Countdown had come up with the idea on his own, that was one thing. But if the idea of pairing Ground Zero's image and deadly explosives to protest unjust media attention had been introduced to Countdown by a third party, then this might not be the last villain attack specifically gunning for Ground Zero's reputation, and Izuku shuddered to think of what the next event might be. A bit selfishly, he hoped it didn't involve more media companies, as he didn't want to end up reporting on his own office building's destruction. If he could even survive an assault of that magnitude. Convulsively, Izuku snapped his notebook shut. He needed to speak to Countdown, to hear for himself whether the Ground Zero connection began with him, or had been handed to him along with a massive amount of plastic explosives. He knew the police were doing that now, but he still felt helpless, and asking people questions, seeking evidence, uncovering the truth, that was his job, too. He didn't have enough for a story yet, but he had enough to sense that something big was brewing, and he didn't like it. He hoped Ground Zero would be ready to face what was coming when it finally showed itself. And, selfishly, he hoped he'd be there to see the explosive hero take it down. Katsuki wouldn't have been able to imagine a scenario where he was wishing for Kirishima and Todoroki's lame-butt intervention. And he hadn't, because he never imagined that Lemillion would be staring at him from across the desk with that carefully crafted disappointed look on his face, threatening him with suspension. "You can't do this," Katsuki protested. "It's your contract, Ground Zero," Lemillion said, his face serious. "I've been gracious enough, giving you time to get your act together. Most casualties result in mandatory suspension pending a ruling about excessive force, but, well, we both know this is a special case." "I don't need a shrink digging into my goddamn head," Katsuki growled. "All mental health professionals on this list are trained in hero-specific mental care," Lemillion shot back. "Beyond that, some of them even attended hero schools. A few got licensed. They know the job. That's a big part of why they feel confident treating people in our line of work." Katsuki stared at the form Lemillion had laid on the desk in front of him, fighting the urge to scream. He didn't want this, he was barely surviving keeping it buried. He knew anyone who tried to get him talking would realize just how badly he was coping. If he had a little more time, he could deal with this on his own. Why couldn't Lemillion see that? "One more week," he managed. "Gimme one dash." "You can have a week, but I'm not letting you back into the field," Lemillion shot back. But no Setagaya was hard. But adding the Countdown case on top of it? "If you want a week, it's going to be a week of vacation." Katsuki couldn't bear to lift his eyes, to look at Lemillion as the hero passed judgment. He hated this. Hated even more that Lemillion was probably right. He wasn't coping. He shouldn't be going back into the field, not after 2 incredibly stressful experiences. That didn't mean he had to like it, either. Grimacing, Katsuki snatched up the pen and signed his name on the form. "Fine, I'll go talk to the counselor," he growled. "Don't take me off the roster." "I won't," Lemillion promised, a hint of "unless the therapist advises me otherwise" in his tone. Katsuki hoped his therapist was kind enough to let him keep working. If he didn't have hero work, he didn't have anything to distract him from everything in his life that had gone horribly wrong. He needed it. Standing suddenly, he eyed Lemillion. "If that's all," he began cautiously. "Oh yes, of course. Though I did take you off today's roster." Lemillion fixed him with a no-nonsense look. "Go make an appointment. When you get back to me with a specific time and date, maybe I'll slot you back in for a later shift." Katsuki just nodded. He needed to make an appointment now, if he wanted a chance to get back out in the field. And he needed that, especially in the wake of Countdown. He needed to prove that he was more than just a symbol of a former employee's frustration. He was ground FENG0, damn it. Without another word, he turned and fled Lemillion's office, list of therapists clutched in his fist. He FING hated interventions. I already told you, Detective Itakazu sighed. I can't tell you what I don't know. You must have a theory, Izuku protested. It was a weak argument, but it was turning out to be a slow news day, so Izuku was dropping in towards the end of the detective's shift to try and get a little bit more from him about the countdown case. He didn't really have anywhere else to be, and Detective Itakazu was usually pretty good about sharing information when he was able. Our working theory is that someone managed to coordinate a lot of small-time villains, provide them with a ridiculous amount of explosives, and somehow convince them to insist that they came up with the idea independently. Detective Itakazu massaged his temples, sighing heavily. Midoriya. I don't have a theory, because I've never seen small-time thugs act like this. When we saw the Stain uprising, at least we had something to work with, a figurehead to investigate. Hell, even the League of Villain had a few key figures. Is it crowd-sourced or organized by social media, like the quirk emancipation movement? Izuku pressed, community-based? Midoriya, Detective Itakazu treated him to a look. As far as we can tell, these guys have nothing in common. They don't live in the same neighborhoods, they don't shop at the same stores, they don't visit the same websites. Hell, I'm not even sure how they all knew to be at the same place at the same time. And they all say they just decided to go spur of the moment, Izuku murmured, glancing at his notes. I told you, we have no theories, Detective Itakazu emphasized. Nothing to tie them together, except they all showed up at the same DMN time. There has to be something. Izuku grumbled, mostly to himself, though Detective Itakazu took it as a legitimate comment. Don't I fucking know it? He groaned, pressing the tips of his fingers to his temples once more. Call me if you find anything, Izuku said, in lieu of comforting words. And thanks for the full list of villains. It should be really helpful. Hasn't been so far, Detective Itakazu grumbled, but you're welcome, for what it's worth. I really am grateful, Izuku said, then considered for a moment. Did any of the other villains have a grudge against Ground Zero? Nah, Itakazu answered, grimacing at the thought. We considered it a possibility, of course, but only Countdown seemed to be harboring any sort of ill will towards Shine Media Group in particular, and he practically worships Ground Zero. Ish. With fans like these, who needs enemies, am I right? Yeah, Izuku agreed, wincing internally. Between this and Setagaya. I already told you, that's not my district. I don't know anything about that mess, the detective said firmly, and you know my position on speculating on the record. Got any speculating you'd be willing to do off the record? Izuku asked. Not particularly, Itakazu made a small face. Does seem a bit out of character, though, him making a mistake like that. What a mess. Almost makes me glad all I've got is this head-scratcher of a villain team-up. Izuku made a sympathetic noise, waiting to see if the detective would be willing to part with any more information. When it seemed none was forthcoming, Izuku coughed slightly. Would you ever consider letting me talk to Countdown? I could let him know you're interested, Itakazu said after a thoughtful pause, but he's already expressed pretty strong anti-media sentiments. If you do get an interview with him, be careful. Izuku grinned innocently. When am I ever not? There, done, Katsuki spat, slapping a paper face down on Lemillion's desk. Put me back on the roster. Ignoring the indecorous way in which Katsuki had chosen to submit his evidence, Lemillion picked up the sheet of paper, glancing over it for a moment before lifting his gaze to stare at Katsuki. You don't have a follow-up appointment scheduled yet, he said. You really think you'll be able to skate by on just one session? I checked my contract, Katsuki shot back. I have to go to the therapist. If they don't consider me a threat to myself or anyone else, not counting villains, of course, then I don't have to go back. One visit is all that's required, so that's all I'm effing doing. Lemillion sighed softly as he turned in his chair to face a filing cabinet behind the desk, opened a drawer and shuffled through several file folders before apparently finding the one he was looking for and slipping the paper inside. I can't make you do any more than your contract stipulates, he agreed, before turning back around and fixing a steely look on Katsuki. Though of course I strongly suggest that you make that follow-up appointment. Katsuki had the feeling that growling not a chance wasn't going to do him any favors, so instead he grunted non-committally. Lemillion didn't seem at all comforted by this response, likely knowing as well as Katsuki that if it wasn't required to get him back in the field, it wasn't FING happening. All right, Lemillion said after a long moment of the two heroes staring each other down. I'll have you on the roster for the third shift tonight. Go get some sleep before your shift starts. Katsuki nodded back. Got it. I'll be back for third shift. He left then, not bothering to thank Lemillion. After all this time, the man knew better than to expect thanks from Katsuki, especially after backing him into a corner. While Katsuki wasn't one to accompany his displeasure with palm-sized explosions anymore, he still wasn't exactly a soft or kind sort either. In fact, Katsuki was rather congratulating himself on not cussing out his superior, especially since that might have encouraged Lemillion to keep him off the roster entirely. Night shift wasn't ideal, considering the work he'd need to do to rebuild his thoroughly trashed image, but it was better than nothing. Now he just needed to figure out a way to calm down from a morning of outrage and get at least some sleep before his shift started. His phone buzzed. Sighing, Katsuki glanced down to see who was contacting him. Mr. Intervention himself, Kirishima. Hardhead, hey man, I heard you got took off the roster, everything okay? Before Katsuki could type a response, a second message rolled in, followed by a third. Hardhead, oh wait NVM, they just added you to late shift. Hardhead, are you in some kind of trouble? Katsuki waited to see if Kirishima was done texting without waiting for a reply. When it seemed his phone had ceased buzzing for the moment, he typed a quick response. Me, you'll be glad to hear the boss finally had his own intervention. That's why he took me off the roster. Made an appointment so he put me back on. Hardhead, oh wow. So you made an appointment? Good for you. Hardhead, so does that mean he took you off the roster then added you back on after you made the appointment? Hardhead, or are you still in trouble? Katsuki sighed. Between the green nerd and his idiot friend, he beginning to wonder if anyone out there knew text message etiquette. How was he supposed to answer if you kept adding message after message? Me, not in trouble. Got late shift. It's fine. Katsuki had barely managed to send off the message before he got Kirishima's reply. Hardhead, oh, good. I was worried for a minute there. Hardhead, wait, if you have the late shift, why aren't you asleep? Katsuki sighed heavily. Me, 3 guesses as to why. Start with the word, idiot. Hardhead, oh. Sorry man. I'll let you sleep now. See you later? Despite himself, Katsuki felt his lips curl into a smile. For all his annoying habits, Kirishima was a good friend. An idiot, but a good idiot. Meet you later. Though he was still irritated, the small exchange had managed to distract Katsuki from his frustration enough that he felt like maybe he'd be able to get some sleep after all. Kirishima was good for that. He cared, and he had managed to pull Katsuki's attention away from his own issues numerous times over the years. He was more than just a good friend, really. He was Katsuki's best friend, and he couldn't imagine life as a pro hero without him. Not that he would ever tell Kirishima that. He'd let it go to his head. The next few days of hero journalism were relatively slow, leaving Izuku with the sorts of puff-piece articles that barely made it off the editorial floor and into the paper. He was pleasantly surprised to text Bakugo once, in the early evening, and actually get a response. The hero was once again on less publicly visible duties, which was likely an intentional PR move by his agency, as the trial date for Setagaya hadn't been set yet, and nobody knew who the prosecutor would be going after. Izuku was fairly certain that if Ground Zero had been truly responsible for any deaths, he would have been pulled from active duty immediately, so he doubted the prosecution was building any sort of case against him. That being said, it was entirely likely that the defense attorney for the lone survivor of the Setagaya incident would try and paint Ground Zero in a bad light, in an effort to divide and confuse the jury, as well as discredit the pro-hero's first-hand account of the tragedy. There were a lot of trashy speculative articles floating around, but fortunately, Izuku's editor still cared about journalism ethics, and wouldn't push him to publish wild speculation. That didn't mean Izuku could get away with publishing nothing, which was why he'd been leaning hard on Detective Itakazu in hopes of actually speaking to Countdown and learning what the villain's true motives may have been. He would have pushed for Setagaya details, too, but that wasn't Itakazu's district, and it was well known by now that given the highly sensitive nature of the incident, much of the details were being concealed until the trial. He was sitting at home on his lumpy two-seat couch, ignoring the TV that was on but muted, still musing on what to do next. He was beginning to think he should just give up on the whole Countdown and Setagaya business altogether, when an unexpected message popped up in his phone. King Explodical, hey. Izuku stared long and hard at the message, trying to decipher what it might mean, or what purpose the hero had in contacting him. He hadn't sent him another message since they'd gotten pancakes, nearly a week ago now, and Izuku had assumed that had been the end of it. It wasn't like he and Bakugo had been friends in high school, and they certainly didn't qualify as friends now. So what was this text about? With a shrug, he decided the only way to find out for sure was to respond in kind. Me, hey yourself. What's up? For a moment, no reply came though. Then the three dots that indicated typing popped up, disappeared, popped up again, disappeared again, and finally, after a few minutes of Izuku staring at his screen, a message finally came through. King Explodo Kill. My therapist says I need to socialize with someone who isn't in my line of work. Bakugo had a therapist? Izuku sank down a bit in the couch, settling into a more comfortable position and preparing to think. He fumbled for his remote, clicking off the TV so he could focus more fully on whatever Bakugo was going to say next. He stared down at his phone, considering what had just been revealed to him, turning it over in his mind. A therapist? Really? Izuku couldn't imagine it. Not that he didn't think the man needed a therapist, he almost certainly did, if his anger issues were anything to go by. Not to mention the stress of whatever had happened in Setagaya and the Countdown situation looming over him. No, what surprised Izuku was the fact that Bakugo had a therapist and was willing to actually listen to the therapist's advice. It seemed almost mind-boggling that the pro-hero would willingly go to therapy, much less actually do something based on whatever conversation he'd had with the mental health professional. The Bakugo he'd known at UA not only didn't take advice, but would have rather died than have it known that he was doing something as ridiculous as going to therapy. Izuku found himself smirking a little bit at the message, in part because he was proud of Bakugo for doing something as uncharacteristic as going to therapy, and in part because the way he admitted it via text was still so very, very like him. Abrasive and obnoxious was Bakugo's default setting, and it made Izuku laugh when he considered the fact that there was no way his therapist had expected Bakugo to open the lines of communication like that. After another moment to consider his response, Izuku finally sent a message back to Bakugo. Me? Congratulations. Does this mean I'm your only non-pro hero acquaintance? King Explodokill. For a moment, Izuku thought he would leave it at that, but then a second message rolled in a moment later. King Explodokill, maybe. That a problem? Izuku couldn't help but chuckle at that. Maybe not a problem for Izuku, but he figured it was probably a problem for Bakugo's therapist. Oh well. Izuku wouldn't know about that unless Bakugo told him, and he doubted the explosive hero had any interest in confessing such a thing. Me? I don't know. Is it? King Explodokill, guess not. You free anytime soon? Before next Thursday. Izuku wondered at the specificity. Me, maybe? What's next Thursday? King Explodokill. Follow up with my therapist, obviously. It might look bad if I don't have anything to share by then. I don't have time to meet new people. Izuku muffled his laugh with his fist, sinking a bit deeper into the couch. Me? So I'm a scapegoat, am I? Your token quirkless friend? King Explodokill. Friend is a strong word. Me? Keep talking like that and I definitely won't be free before next Thursday. Izuku didn't take Bakugo's resistance to the word friend seriously. The man clearly had issues, not the least of which being his inability to have fun unless he was being competitive about it. Friendship to Bakugo was probably working out in the gym, training a quirk together with his pro-hero buddies, and maybe comparing protein shake recipes. It wouldn't have occurred to him to consider Izuku a friend, even if they had seen each other more than twice in the past month, which they hadn't. And Izuku wasn't really in a position to consider Bakugo a friend, either. It was just annoying to keep writing the word acquaintance, and part of him might have hoped that their connection could become more than just an antagonistic banter that resulted from being bullied into buying the other a coffee. He was still friends with several other pro heroes, so it wasn't like there was no chance at all of it happening. He could admit, though, that Bakugo was harder to get close to than most of the people he knew. Which probably explained why his therapist was making him socialize more, now that he thought about it. King Explodo Kill. If you don't have time, just say so and stop asking for dumb shit. Me, you think friendship is dumb shit? King Explodo Kill. All my friends are idiots, so yeah. I guess if you wanted to be my friend, at least you fit the bill in that sense. King Explodo Kill. Always. So are you FING free or aren't you? Izuku couldn't seem to suppress the grin he knew he was wearing on his face as he replied. Me, I'm not the one with the weird schedule, Mr. Hero. Tell me a time and a place, I'll make it work. The one advantage of being a reporter was the flexibility to not go into the office. While he typically tried not to overuse his privilege, there was always a chance he'd lose it if he took too much advantage of the flex time. He thought that meeting up with a pro hero fell well within the bounds of a work meeting, if anyone were to ask him. Even if the meeting was technically off the record. Still, maybe he'd learn something that he could run with later, and get some confirmations on the record. It was worth a try, and Bakugo was a funny guy when he wasn't being obnoxious and annoying. Maybe it was more that he was funny and obnoxious. Because he couldn't really think of a time when the guy wasn't infuriating. But for some reason, it didn't bother him nearly as much anymore. Which was a surprise, but not altogether unwelcome. King Explodo Kill. Tomorrow morning. Shinjuku. Oh my god, never mind, Izuku hated him so much. Me? Are you serious? Shinjuku Station during commute hours? Who the hell do you think you are? No friendship is worth that. King Explodo Kill. Make it a late start then. Commuters should be gone by 10. King Explodo Kill. Still not a friendship. Izuku chuckled to himself as he typed his reply. Me? Can't blame me for trying, winky face. King Explodo Kill. Can and will. Shinjuku Station tomorrow. 10 a.m. Izuku scowled, considering how long it would take to get there. Only an hour or so from his apartment, which was a relief. He would probably be able to escape the majority of the commute, then. He'd have to transfer trains once or twice, which was annoying, but he'd deal with it. He'd probably end up on the Yamanote line, which was a miserable thing to consider, but he was already looking forward to meeting up again. Me, fine. Should I dress up? King Explodo Kill. Wear whatever you want. Unhelpful, but then, when was Bakugo ever helpful? It was par for the course, really. Me. See you tomorrow. Of course Bakugo didn't reply, his confirmation all he needed to stop texting. His availability changed to offline mere moments later, and Izuku wondered if he'd gone on shift or gone to bed. Considering the way Bakugo's schedule had been shifted around in the wake of the countdown incident, he had no real way to know until the reports came in. Sighing, Izuku uncurled himself from his little couch, shaking his arms and legs out before turning to his bedroom door. There were still a few hours before he needed to get some sleep of his own, but before then, the least he could do was pick out something to wear tomorrow. And maybe bother Detective Itakazu again. Despite himself, he was actually looking forward to tomorrow.